Yeah, we live now still.
How's it going, guys?
Peace to all the viewers locked in as well. Yeah, that's the special guest still to be announced. That's man like Hamza.
What's going on, guys? What's going on?
We've got James in the building. Obviously, James SC. He's the most hated right now in the corner. He's a hate preacher. He's a certified hate preacher. Mad thing. But yeah, this I wanted to put on this show air because when James was reading out the hadith about the treatment that Muslims should give to Christians and Jews, about what is it, push them into the sidewalk and don't greet them before they greet them or something like that.
Yeah, that was one of the hadith that was argued about on Sunday.
I saw in the comment section Hamza was rebutting that claim, saying that was in a specific context of wartime or something like that. Is that right, Hamza?
Yeah, these are some of the opinions of the scholars. That incident or that statement was at a time for following war.
Yeah, so I wanted to get the clarity without having to read the whole of the 1 million paragraphs that Hamza pasted. So I thought, let me just do a live show and just listen instead, get the audio book. So that's the purpose of this live show still. So I'm gonna let you man take over. I'm gonna be quiet for a minute.
How's it going, James? You okay?
Hi, I'm good.
Okay, cool. So I was just asked literally 5 minutes ago to engage with you in this discussion because from what I understood, you wanted to go over it again. And there's a few questions I wanted to ask you. Just generally, I needed to clear a few things out. Adnan, what made you approach Adnan in the way that you did?
Well, it was about 6 months ago that I came across the video of Adnan attending one of Abdullah Faisal's lectures, and you can hear him speaking, and it's pretty distinctively his voice, and someone says Adnan at the end of the video, and in it he kind of says things like, well, people will have already seen the video, so I won't summarize it too much, but from that kind of, Abdullah Faisal was well known for spreading very hateful rhetoric towards the West and non-Muslims, and I realized that people's views change over 15 years. I know several former followers of Abdullah Faisal. However, certain things about Adnan kind of make me wonder, maybe want to kind of get some clarification. I'm not going to automatically assume that he's nowhere near Abdullah Faisal anymore. One of those things being that, for example, he defends to a very high degree Islamic history, and it seems analogous to me as if if a white person kind of was to say, there was nothing wrong with colonialism, people would think, well, hold on, that's a little bit suspicious. Clearly there was something wrong. Do you have it seems to me that someone who held that opinion it's sort of evidence of slightly supremacist views, and so so I wanted to ask him clearly about kind of him attending Abdullah Faisal's lecture.
And what did you kind of gather from the discussions? What is his current position, which is the most important thing, right?
Yeah, his current position is that he is against kind of terrorism and violent methods. I know that.
And that's quite clear seeing all of his works, especially of recent, that he speaks quite vocally. Even Ali Dawa, Muhammad Hijab, and most of the Dawah team, if I'm correct, there at the park. There's even documentations online which number into thousands of pages about Muslims who have distanced themselves, condemned terrorism. And from what I understand, Adnan Rashid has been one of the foremost spokesperson for condemning. So I didn't really understand as to why was the need to challenge him thereafter, after he had made it clear. And I think you were aware as well that he himself is quite distant from Muhajirun or Anjem Chowdhury, as you mentioned. So
Yeah.
I didn't fully understand as in the approach you were taking in that discussion, because he made quite clear that he doesn't believe that was him. And even had it been him, he said it was doctored. Even had it been him, we understand for certain that his position has changed, right?
Well, let me clarify a couple of things there. So I think, for one thing, it's still, if he did something bad in the past, I think you still need to admit to it. So the fact that he is kind of not admitting to it, and even though it's pretty clearly him, I think kind of that does show some dishonesty, and I'm not going to kind of let someone off the hook and kind of pretend that something bad that they previously did never happened, just because like they feel differently now. Secondly, in terms of how different his opinions are from Abdullah Faisal, I agree that he's totally against terrorism and violent methods, but I still think that several of his views for what he would like society to look like in the future bear a kind of discriminatory element and quite a kind of brutal element. So, like, for example, something like returning to a death penalty for apostasy, returning to a legal system where kind of people are killed if they convert away from Islam, things like that. So kind of just because someone is just because someone
have you spoken to him in regards to that, any of those issues? Because we have to be clear. I know it sounded like you had a bit of doubt about his position there, as you just mentioned it. But have you actually spoken to him in regards to whether he deems it as treason, which is a state crime, or whether he thinks that this is perdition?
I think, given his staunch defense of historical Islamic law, like Sharia as it's been applied in history, given his staunch and unwavering defense of that, I have good reason to assume that he would, like those legal systems of the medieval period, believe that death penalty applies simply for changing your religion, like as though a baker living in the Islamic State, if that Muslim baker decides I'm a Buddhist and then kind of continues being a baker, like you can't call that treason, like supporting an enemy state, can you? It seems a bit ridiculous, and yet that's what the legal systems were. So and also kind of he's declared or he seems quite close with Haytham al-Haddad, who is another person who I think there's good reason to suspect would have quite a harsh views on what the legal system should ideally be. Just like conventional orthodox Sharia law as recorded in the kind of fiqh books.
So okay. So the standard you're using, if I'm correct, is a liberal kind of democratic standard to say that what Haytham Haddad as well as Adnan holds is extreme, right? Because you can't say something extreme unless you yourself have a position.
Yeah. Broadly.
Okay. And so another thing is one thing. I don't even doubt that you don't know this, but you don't expect everyone to be walking encyclopedias of knowledge, do you? As in, I know you don't, but I just need to clarify this because the approach that you took from mild-mannered, your usual mild-mannered way, radically changed that day. It was just interesting to see, almost hilarious. But I just need to clarify that you don't actually think, James, that everyone is a walking encyclopedia and that you can pick up some books or some reading at home, come to the park and expect everyone, including Adnan, to know all of the answers there and then, right?
Nope. If he didn't, but the fact that he was willing to kind of come up with a defense, on the fly by himself, even though it wasn't really valid, and even though he wasn't sort of, you know, he didn't know what the actual case was, but he still kind of, you know, came up with something anyway. I think, you know, that shows that he'd be willing to defend anything that's given a kind of Sahi classification, you know, and that's something quite typical among kind of Salafi style people, that they'll, you know, if I could probably make up a hadith, kind of print it out in a kind of authoritative looking page, and I could have gone to Adnan and shown him something that he had never heard before, and he would try to come up with a defense for it, no matter how kind of heinous it was. I mean,
But
maybe
that
would be
would obviously based upon deception, right?
that it would be a deception, but it would show the kind of mindset that he has. That, you know, it would show that it would show something about this kind of Salafi mindset, which I consider kind of quite dangerous.
But this is what I was mentioning to you. You see it as a believer or someone who's faithful. We believe first and foremost God exists. Once you can accept that God exists, you can accept that this prophet's one under, of course, after examination, and you can understand this legal framework also. And we as lay people won't have all knowledge of all disciplines, so we take to a certain extent some kind of following or dependence upon scholars or knowledgeable people. So if you were to, for example, write something on a piece of play paper, I don't know, write a source and reference being one of the Sunan ibn Majah or something, then taken to Adnan. Of course, naturally, assuming that it wasn't something, an act of deception on your half, someone, whether it be Adnan or someone else, would want to defend that because they believe that this is authentic in terms of a theological point of view.
But I mean, why would you necessarily? I mean, there's kind of two slight issues here. The kind of less important one, but since I started, I'll kind of finish it anyway, is I'm not quite sure why, under kind of certain Islamic kind of methodologies or manhajas, I don't know why people would place that much trust in a hadith report as being, you know, something that Muhammad actually said. Because, like, you know, if you're a historian and you've got a bunch of reports of things that happened or that are claimed to have happened, you do have to apply and think, is there an incentive for the person reporting this to have changed it or made it up? So, like, for example, you know, that has, I mean, it's, I'm not making, I mean, obviously you'll be familiar with like the kind of theories and reasoning about how kind of Umayyads might have like kind of come up with some hadith that would help them kind of rule their society in a kind of smooth way by encouraging you know, obedience and encouraging kind of idolizing kind of certain Sahaba members and
So are you on the assumption that there's no discipline, no science for the extrapolation or the grading of these narrations, historical narrations? Because history, from what I understand, obviously isn't the past. The past is something that happened. History is just trying to record what had actually happened. So you see, in most of actual history, you have different reports of possibilities and each have different confidences. Like, you can be 80% certain that this happened, whereas in another person's view it could be 60%, or there could be an alternative history. You see what hadith science actually done? It went and looked at all of the names of the persons which you were just mentioned just now. It actually did. It's a science called ilm rijal, where they have biographies of every single person that passed down information. Whereas history that you have it is just something written by someone in a book and presented to you. We don't know as to how the person received that information. We don't know the validity of it. If it was passed down initially by oral transmission, how good was that person's retention or observation of the incident, his retention of the information, his articulation of the information, not only including his sincerity in conveying that information. So there is a strand of hadith studies called ilm rijal that actually looks at all of this, and this was done very early on in the early stages of Islam. So we actually have that, but I think we're going slightly into a different topic. But maybe we
Sure.
can catch up on that in the later part of this segment. So we spoke about Adnan's position. Currently, is quite clear that he doesn't actually condone the person that you were suggesting initially, who he may have been condoning. We understood that people won't necessarily answer or be able to answer everything. Now going into the crux of the discussion, which was that you were speaking about the hadith.
It,
Do
it,
you
wa-
have
it
the
was
hadith
it was two
material?
it was two hadiths, but we can start with the first one.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. I can screen share it. That might be a good thing.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna.
I'm working off one phone. It's a bit difficult for me to.
But it's so that the audience
But
can see
I'll.
it.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to imagine it as
Okay.
you're talking.
So I'll read this out. It's
Mm.
Sahih Muslim. Abu Huraira reported Allah's messenger as saying, "Do not greet the Jews and the Christians before they greet you, and when you meet any one of them on the roads, force him to go to the narrowest part of it."
Mm-hmm. So your contention here is that they were being so let's go into the order that we actually had this discussion. So what happened in this discussion is that you were arguing that the Christians and Jews from this hadith were being oppressed by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, on the basis of this hadith. So this is what the crux of your discussion with Adnan Rashid was. And then I commented in one of the videos giving a context, and context is extremely important. So I mentioned that the hadith which you said, which says la tabda'u al-yahud wala nasara bisalam, it's saying that don't initiate the giving of salutations or salam to the Christians nor the Jews. So I explained that this was in a particular setting, and that was after war. So what happened was there was a constitution when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he left Makkah after being persecuted by Quraysh for 10 years plus. And his life was threatened, his uncle was killed, his daughter was killed, and his grandson that she was pregnant with was killed also. So many of the Prophet's companions had been tortured. Samaya radiallahu anha, we know, was also killed. So he actually left them without waging war on them, and he went on to Medina. And when he got into Medina, he was received by the people. I'm just giving a quick background. It can be lengthy at times, forgive me. But anyway, he was welcomed by the people there, and he ratified the constitution, which is known as Mithaq al-Medina, which I think I gave a passing comment in one of the comments I replied to you. And this mithaq, or this constitution, one of it's suggested as one of the earliest documentations we have in regards to peace treaties or constitutions to form societies together. And the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, he formed an ummah which included the Jewish tribes there at the time. So they all agreed that they will protect one another and not betray each other and live together. So then what happened was Quraysh, they came marching on to Quraysh of Makkah, who had persecuted the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, came down to Medina. So the Prophet, he dug a trench under the idea of one of his companions. They dug a trench around Medina. Now Medina at the time is very small. It's not like how it is now. The city of Medina is very small. So they dug a trench around Medina, and the Quraysh had to camp outside of that trench. And eventually, there was a siege on the people of Medina where they were being starved, they were hungry, nothing was going in and out, the trading was effective, more or less economical sanctions. And you can imagine all the horror that comes along with being sieged. So then, after they left, because in short, the weather changed for them and they had to leave. And Rasulullah, then he says this hadith which said that if you were to meet the Jews or the Christians, then do not initiate. This is what the hadith says. La tabdu. Do not initiate the salutation. It does not say do not reply. It says do not initiate the salutation with them. And it says that you should walk down the path. Let me find the hadith properly. And it says,
I have your comment up on my screen, so I can read it out if you want. the one you left
Yeah,
on
فإذا
TV.
لقيتم أحدهم. So if you were to meet one of them, في طريق, in the road, it says, then make them take his narrowest path. This is what the hadith says. Your contention was that this was unkind, if I remember your words correctly, that this was unkind. Is that still the contention that you hold?
Yeah, I think it's not a good example to be, or not a good friendly teaching to be giving to people. It kind of spreads unfriendly sentiment and that sort of thing. It's not an ideal moral example.
One of the things I tend to actually do when I do my reading often is very slow, is try to be vicarious. So I'm asking you, James, if you were in a position of siege, and try to be, in that position yourself. There's an army ahead of you who's trying to kill you. Now you've pushed away the army, and now the ones who had betrayed you within your city, even though you had a constitution with them that they should fight with you, and they betrayed you. Not only did they not fight with you, they went and aided the ones who had come all the way from Makkah to try to kill you and the people inside Medina. Now you want to go onto those who had betrayed you. Would you go around giving salutations in a military march if you were a leader?
No.
Honestly.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah,
What you brought a good piece of evidence, which was from Musnad Ahmad. You quoted kind of hadith 26,695, and it says, "Verily, I will depart against the Jews of the Banu Qurayza in the morning. So do not greet them with peace, and if they greet you with peace, then say, up and upon you." So this is a good piece of evidence that helps make a compelling case for the hadith being about a particular tribe of Jews and a particular historical context. And I think that goes a long way to help kind of diffuse the claims I'm making. However, what I don't think it manages to sort out is the fact that the hadith report says, sorry, I bring this up again. It says, do not greet the Jews and the Christians before they greet you, and force them to the narrowest part of the road. Having this historical event of the Banu Qurayza betraying the Muslims wouldn't seem to justify kind of Muhammad saying, "Don't greet the Christians as well." Do you see my point? So.
I understand, but these were clearly for him to be saying that he can't be referring to anyone who had been fighting with the Muslims against Quraysh. He must be referring to those who were not engaged in any fighting of the attacking enemy. So again, imagine you're on a march.
Again? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, sure. For the statement to be made that you don't give salam or salutations to the Jews nor the Christians, the people is referring to are those who are not engaged in any form of battle. Do you follow that logic, Dr.?
You became quiet just in the last 10 seconds. Hamza?
Hello?
Hello, yeah, now I can hear you properly now.
Sorry, apologies. Someone is calling me. Let me just message them to tell them not to call me. Yeah, sorry, apologies. I'm saying that this, for the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, to say don't give salam or salutation to these guys after the battle, then it's quite clear that these people weren't engaged in battle either against or for the Prophet. So can you imagine now the Prophet and the believers, they just come out of war, starving and everything, and for the Prophet to even tell them don't initiate salutation, it shows that this is the behavior, the normal adat, or the normal behavior or culture of the Muslim, is to initiate the salutations. But the Prophet in this instance, he says don't do it unless they give you salam. Now, obviously after war, you can imagine that the skepticism of those around you may be very high. So the Prophet is saying until they show kindness to you, only then reciprocate it to them. It's saying don't do it there initially, don't give them salam. It's almost as a form of weakness. You've just survived this battle. Don't go out there being cheerful so people may take or manipulate you in a point of weakness. So I don't think it's a situation which is unkind. And this is where I asked you a few seconds ago, if you had been in war and you just survived war, would you go out giving salutations as the first thing you do?
No, not for like the sort of, not immediately afterwards, while it still seems a kind of I know potentially a shaky situation. However, it almost reminds me a little bit of when, for example, the United States was in a war with Japan, and then kind of the United States felt kind of wary of its Japanese citizens, and so it kind of rounded up all its Japanese citizens and forced them to kind of live under supervision. Obviously, that's like many steps higher, but it's still, it's still the kind of it's a kind of a slightly kind of harsh
Suspicion.
measure to kind of, rather than thinking kind of, this
So,
one
James, do you
type of,
really think it's harsh? Because what it's saying, it's not saying
well,
you don't give.
hold on. Can I
Sure.
finish making, so like, rather than thinking kind of these Banu Qurayza have betrayed me, and so kind of, watch out, and so I'm going to recommend to Muslims from now on, kind of, don't greet Jews in general, and don't kind of greet Christians in general, kind of, even though kind of you have like several other Jews who presumably kind of did not betray and were sort of good allies. Kind of, I don't know, it's but like so I mean it still doesn't seem like entirely fair.
So you're saying it's unkind. It's not any form of. It's just unkind.
Well, it's like
Do you see what I'm saying? It seems like you're making.
It's more like it's I don't think it's the sort of best kind of behavior to be recommending for the future.
So after war, we hold on to the future part because I'm not sure where you got the future from, because this was a situational or circumstantial
well, the thing is,
order, right?
Well, possibly, but then again, other kind of Muslim scholars kind of disagree about that, and so many other Muslim scholars have run with the idea that this is kind of the norm for how you should run an Islamic state.
Agreed.
So that there is a legacy within kind of medieval or classical Islamic jurisprudence to kind of.
But there's a backdrop behind that, right?
There's a what?
There's a backdrop which Adnan explained to you behind that, right? As to why the Prophet ﷺ, he ordered the people not to give salam until they give you, and why the scholars suggest that this wasn't time bound. There's a backdrop towards this idea, right?
I'm not. Are you referring to when kind of Adnan kind of told the story about Muhammad hearing some Jews saying "Death be upon you"?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and even then, when Aisha radiallahu anha was with the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, she replied in a harsh manner. And what did the Prophet do? He rebuked not the Jew first. He rebuked his wife, saying, Aisha, Allah, He loves kindness. This is what the statement of Rasulullah was. Even though Aisha radiallahu anha was only replying or responding to the malice in the statement of the Jew who said, he said, death be upon you. And Rasulullah he says, alaykum wa alaykum, and upon you. And thereafter there was that mode of suspicion, as in you greet them with that which they greet you. And some of the scholars, not all scholars, some of them suggest that you do not initiate with them. Yes, that's true.
Okay. Yeah.
So there is a context behind that, and it's reasonable if someone had said to you at your initiation of giving salam, if I had said to you, death be upon you, and the very least you did was just simply said, and upon you, and thereafter only expected me to initiate it, would you think that was unkind?
No,
I've just told you,
not
death
doing,
be upon you.
Yeah, it's like if someone's being unkind to you, like just saying and upon you, that's okay. It's
Okay,
more
so that's great.
It's more about like kind of
we're talking about the Prophet, right? At the moment, we're not talking about scholars or people. We're talking about
no,
the Prophet, peace and
no.
blessings be upon him.
Yeah.
Great.
Like
Okay.
So like I think.
So the first thing was that it's something that happens at a specific time, which was on the march to a tribe, a Jewish tribe called Banu Qurayza, who betrayed them at a time of war and could have caused them serious civilian casualty.
I
So the
still
Prophet.
don't feel like I still don't quite understand like where we arrived at in terms of why the Hadith says to behave this way towards Christians as well.
Well, what was the composition of Medina in terms of its residents?
I don't know.
In terms of there's Jews and Christians.
Okay.
Yeah, there may have been Zoroastrians, but perhaps they were insignificant amount. I can't tell you at the moment. But what's clear is that these are the main residents. So the Prophet is saying, don't give salam to any of the residents, more or less. He said, don't initiate. He doesn't say don't respond to it. He says, straight out of war, let them give you salam and just reply to them in the same way that they replied or they initiated with you. And for him to have said that is quite clear that the habit of the Muslims were to initiate the salam. Because people don't give warnings to stop something, except that the people were doing this previously.
Okie dokie. So because the Banu Qurayza had betrayed the Muslims, kind of the rest of Medina was kind of suspect at that point.
The tensions were high after war. Naturally, tension is always high, right?
Okay.
All
right.
You can rationalize that, right?
Yeah. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to kind of make a little point here, which is that kind of one of the sort of overall one of the kind of views I have is that kind of the Quran and Hadith reports have such a wide range of teaching concerning behavior towards non-Muslims, kind of
just
ranging
before we
from...
go off sorry, James, should we finish the conversation here as to the back and forth that we had before we go to different topics?
Oh yeah, well I'm saying like, well, I don't have anything else to say about the that particular Hadith. So yeah.
Okay, so let me just so basically, okay, you have no contentions at all, no comebacks or because we're dealing with history, we're dealing with probabilities as well, and we could say this happened, we could say that happened, but what's quite clear is in another hadith which expands on the first hadith, it says that this statement of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, do not initiate salam until they initiate it with you. And this is following after war. And this is natural. You want to show some kind of military sternness. You want to show that you're serious. And the second part of the hadith, I think you had contention with, was to push them to the side of the road, correct?
Yeah, but that's kind of covered with that can also be explained by if it was kind of meant to be only, you know, just after this this kind of betrayal, it still seems unfortunate that this teaching kind of didn't make that kind of so explicitly clear, because, you know, if even like kind of scholars who have studied the Sunnah far more than me kind of arrived at the wrong conclusion, then, you know, it seems as though his message wasn't preserved very well for this particular teaching, because, you know, it's not like...
So we'll speak about the hadith in a second, the preservation of hadith, we'll speak about that. I don't want to let that topic off.
Well, no, but I mean like, so sometimes in hadith, the hadith will include a bit of a quote from Muhammad, like, for example, kind of in one hadith, like Muhammad, or in several reported hadith, Muhammad says, myself and the hour were sent like this and this. And then the hadith report also kind of includes a description from the Sahaba, saying, kind of the Sahaba reporting it, saying Muhammad held up his two fingers, indicating that he was speaking about the gap between the two fingers, you know? So it seems unfortunate that a similar kind of bit of explanation wasn't also recorded in the hadith, you know? Because otherwise kind of you reach an entirely different conclusion. So
I just want to clarify, because I don't fully grasp the contention you're making about the hadith where the Prophet, peace and blessings, said that me and the last hour have been sent like this, and then he raised his two fingers and he put them together to indicate that there was no space between the two, meaning that him and the hour had come extremely close, meaning the last hour, as in Judgment Day, had come at extremely close proximity to each other. I didn't understand your contention of that hadith.
Well, I was using it to give an example. I was using it to give an example of how kind of sometimes when a Sahaba is reporting something that Muhammad did, he will, in his hadith report, also explain the context, and that will be passed on down the chain. But I'm saying that explanation of context hasn't been included in this hadith report, and so it has led to this misunderstanding that has actually been passed on within Islamic jurisprudence. Wait
a minute. So what, James, are you saying now that since Hamza was given his explanation, that you're more in favor of his explanation that is in that specific context?
Yeah, more than before. I still think it's open to interpretation. That's a plausible interpretation.
Are you going to be using it in the corner?
Sorry?
Are you still going to be using it in the corner to prove that?
No. There are stronger ones that can be used.
Okay. So what are you saying? Are we going to get into those stronger ones now? There's no point in beating the dead horse.
Let me go through a few more things, if that's okay.
Because before you do, the whole point, the objective was to try and prove that there's teachings from what do you say, Islamic jurisprudence?
Teachings from Islam, let's say,
that encourage unfair and unjust and even hatred towards non-Muslims. That was your whole point of bringing up that specific hadith, right?
Yeah.
So
and also the reason why I brought it up in the park was, to show that kind of Adnan and
people
Adnan in particular would try and kind of sort of cover for this and not denounce
no, but James is slightly unfair to, what it is, when Muslims, or I speak mainly for myself, when I go to the park, I speak to atheists about everything. I speak to Christians about everything, literally from parchment to paper to ink composition to oral tradition to the contents of the Bible as well as the companion. And then I also speak to Hindus, for example. And there's a multiplicity of sciences that the Muslim is expected to know. You don't generally see many other people expected to know so many things. It's very difficult to have these expectations on someone like Adnan, who is extremely knowledgeable, mashallah. Yeah, you can't expect him to have the answers there and then. And at times, obviously, clearly, people can escalate in how emotive they are in a discussion. So, for example, now we're talking about something we both know the argument about. If you were to bring me other verses or other chapters, I easily concede in the beginning of this discussion, I may not know them. And this is the problem with the corner. It's always about, I got you. People go home, the DCCI, the Christian missionaries, they go home, they learn one thing. This has been their recent tactic. And instead of coming to the park and trying to have a conversation and a discussion, they expect the person whom they're asking to know the answers there and then, as if the person is a walking encyclopedia, but nobody is.
I don't think so, because there's nothing wrong with saying, I will look into this matter and I'll see you next week.
That's something great. That's why I think if you read in the comments, you see that people applaud your humility in saying that. And this is why I appreciate the discussion with you. But many people, their pride gets in the way. Yeah. What we try to do in the corner is, well, Muslims anyway, what they try to do is speak about the first and most important thing, which is the oneness of God and his existence, or his existence and his oneness. And the worship should only be due to him. Everything thereafter falls in place, like Sharia, the legal systems which mirror the legal systems in Judaism. The thing what we tend to do, James, and this is what I was saying about morality, is judge religious morality by our individual morality. Now, where do we get our individual morality? That's a very important question. For us to use that as a standard against God's morality, how do we know our standards are correct? This was another part in our discussion.
Sure. Well, I think one helpful kind of starting point is that you could think about what would it mean for morality to be objective, and what we mean when, what we generally understand when you say something's subjective, that means it kind of depends on someone's opinion, right? And objective is something that doesn't depend on anyone's opinion. And so I'd say, if you believe that morality is objective, you would have to believe that it doesn't depend on anyone's opinion, even God's. Because if you say that God is the one who defines morality, then it would be possible for God to tomorrow kind of descend and say, from now on, it's a good thing to kind of torture babies. And if you truly believe that God was the one who defined morality, then once he said that, that would be good. And I think that's a kind of contradictory statement. Like, I don't believe it would become good to kill babies if God said that. And so I think for morality to be objective, something has to be good, and then God advises us to do it because it's good, rather than something becomes good simply because God advises us to do it.
Could it not be that God has the vantage points, that he sees everything because he is timeless? Time is a property of the universe. We say the creator, he lays beyond this time. So God, who has a vantage point, as in he sees the future, he can then tell you what the best maxim is. As Immanuel Kant said, I think you mentioned you didn't understand a few of the points in my message, where Immanuel Kant has his first principle. He said, act only in accordance to the law that you should wish it, or to the maxim that you should wish it to be universal. Now, some situations, they don't provide good. And this is what Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mills used to speak about when the discussion with deontology and utilitarianism. I think you're familiar with the discussions in philosophy, moral philosophy. The question I want to ask you, though, is how do you define good without a God? Because good, assumingly, and follow me with this discussion, if you believe in good, you believe in bad, right?
Yeah.
If you believe in good and bad, you believe in moral codes or laws. If you believe in a moral law, you must believe in a moral lawgiver, because laws don't appear from nowhere. These are not random things. So if you don't believe in God, you can't believe in a moral lawgiver, nor moral law, nor good nor bad, and then your question falls apart.
So yeah, what I'd say is that kind of just like, so I don't personally know whether or not morals are an objective part of the universe, or whether they're something, or whether they're simply kind of behaviors which human beings have evolved. And I don't know which one is which, or which it is. However, what I do think is that if it is an objective part of the universe, then I'd say, just like God can't, for example, God can't make a married bachelor or a square circle. He can't do things that are kind of intrinsic to reality, things that are necessarily true. He can't change things like that. I don't think it would make sense for God to be able to to change things like logic, for example. I think if you take the view that right and wrong is genuinely objective, then I think that would also have to apply that. Then right and wrong would occupy that same state as logic, where God can't kind of make a square circle, just like he can't make it good for
that's
someone
not
to talk.
that's not
Sorry,
the
can I finish?
inability of.
Can I finish the point? Like,
Yeah,
just like
sure,
God
sure.
can't make a square circle, so can he not create, or so can he not make it good for someone to kind of torture a baby just for his, satisfaction? So I think that's what objective morality means. Like, if morals are objective, they're like, God can't change them, and they're there prior to God, and God would give commands and recommendations and say, kind of, do this because it's good, rather than anything becoming good simply because God said to do it. So I mean, I'm quoting basically Euthyphro's dilemma, and I think it's really important for anyone who kind of believes that God defines morality. I think it's really important for people to kind of familiarize themselves with this properly, because I'm not doing the best job of like talking about all the different arguments for and against, and so I'm just like referring to it. People should look into it kind of properly themselves.
Okay. So I mentioned, what does good and bad even mean if you don't have God? Because we believe good, even the words themselves are loaded. For atheists, there's no such thing as good. That's why Richard
He's
Dawkins,
agnostic. He's agnostic.
he's agnostic. Either way, it's still the same thing. Unless you believe in God, the concept of good and evil is very loaded theologically. If you check the definition, because atheists such as Richard Dawkins,
He's saying God
they're
and the evil devil. That was it.
no, the
Oh, well.
concept of good and evil are loaded terms. It indicates some
That
kind
is,
of
yeah.
higher being. You see, if I say we as human beings are just to survive, and this is the atheistic or the extreme scientific position, that we're here to spread our DNA and keep it surviving. So really and technically, when, for example, a tiger kills an antelope or a deer, we don't say that he has murdered. We don't say murdered, because this is a concept of good and bad. But if a human kills another human, we say it has murdered, because we say these are moral agents. These people believe in good and bad because it has been given by a lawgiver. They are governed by laws to act in a particular way. Whereas with animals, we don't say that. So the second point that he made was about logical impossibilities, square circle, married bachelor, and everything. And this, the impossibility doesn't lie in the ability of God. The impossibility, it lays in the flawed logic of the question. So these are two different things. If I say, for example, make me, or can God make a rock that he can't also.
Sorry to cut you quickly. So what do you think he means when he says that it's not good to, if you don't believe in God? I don't know if he does or not, but he's agnostic, so it's up in the air in it whether there's a God or not. But so he's not going to attribute goodness to that. But what do you think he means when he says that to treat somebody unfairly, like in reference to the that hadith what he gave, like don't greet them first and all of the things there. What do you think he means when he says that's not good then?
I understand what he means, but this is completely arbitrary. For example, if you do not have God, how are you determining what is good? This is an out of the heart theory.
All I'm saying is
Yeah.
that, right, scrap the word good then.
Yeah.
Is that feeling that you understand, that I understand, that he understands. This is what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the thing. The point is,
at the same time, we could say to you, prove God then.
yeah, this is a discussion we should be having, to be honest, because everything that follows thereafter would be much easier. But let's stick to what he had said, because the whole concept of good, we spoke about absolute and arbitrary. The thing is, the morals that he's applying is very arbitrary. So then, me as a third person, I can't say that he is right or wrong, because his morality or his morals, they differ from mine. They're not absolute. In a case you believe in a God or a higher being who has a vantage point and knows all best possibilities, then we can say that this God or this agent knows the most absolute moral or moral goodness, whereas you don't. What you deem, for example, Hitler deemed himself to be good. Mother Teresa deemed herself to be good. How can I, as a third party person who has their own arbitrary morals, then say who is right and wrong? I can't, because all
That's why we
moral now belongs
we form cliques.
arbitrary. Huh?
We form cliques with people who share the same values as us,
That's right.
and then we
That's
go to
right.
war.
That's right. The thing is, though, now, when we reevaluate our morals, we realize that our morality has been shaped into the way it is. So, how free are we in terms of our agency?
So can you
Sorry,
repeat
sorry.
just the very last kind of
Say that
question?
again. Say that again.
Yeah. Okay, we're kind of going into other things like agnosticism and everything. So anyway, the point of morality, that the discussion on morality that I was having, is that without belief in a God, that you can't really have a determination of what is good and bad, except that determination is arbitrary. Like
Okay.
what your belief of good and bad is going to differ from what my belief of good and bad is, correct? So then my
Yeah.
question now would be, how do we determine whose morality we should follow?
Okay. So it could be the case that, for example, it could be the case that even though we can't tell for sure in some situations, kind of what's the best thing or what's the worst thing, what's good and what's bad, because there are such things as moral dilemmas. So even though
Yes.
kind of the truth might be out of our reach, the truth kind of might still be there. So it could be, and so I'd say like the fact that kind of we can't necessarily measure the truth perfectly or always be certain of the things that we conclude doesn't necessarily mean that kind of an actual truth doesn't exist, or an actual kind of answer for like what's right or wrong in this situation.
Mhm.
Secondly, so about kind of things being arbitrary, kind of I'd say in fact that if you believe that it is God who defines what is good, then in fact good and evil become arbitrary, like truly arbitrary, on what God decides to say, on what his whims are, kind of at that point. Because at that point, if you say that kind of God defines morality, like I said before, kind of he could kind of tomorrow kind of decide to say it's good to kind of torture babies, and then kind of that would become good. And I think and then tomorrow, and then the day after, he could say it's no longer good to torture babies. And so at that point, kind of morality becomes a bit meaningless. It's just like the whims of a kind of powerful tyrant. And I know the kind of final sort of the final kind of like thought experiment I think you should have a little think about is that if you think that if you lived in a if there were no gods, then kind of morality there wouldn't really be such a thing as morality. Kind of one like little thought experiment that's good to do is like ask yourself what if God said I no longer attach any moral significance to any actions that humans do from now on. At that point, do you really think that kind of there'd suddenly be nothing wrong with kind of stealing, like lying, kind of killing, raping, and so on and so forth? I think that I
No,
think
we
kind of
don't
thinking
say
about
this, James.
what.
We don't say this. I explained that God is a being who has a vantage point, that he knows everything because he is beyond time. And we say that he knows ultimately what is best. And out of all the possibilities, what appears to be not so good in your eyes, it may be good on a society level. It trumps individuals' perception of what is good. And we say that God Almighty, He chooses the best route out of all of the possibilities. We're not all saying that once God determines arbitrarily what is good, and it could be something like killing babies, that it all of a sudden becomes good for all of society. No, we're saying that God knows the best possibility in terms of.
Okay, but if you say that, then you're kind of referring to a sense of something being best that's kind of prior to or independent of God. But God simply,
we don't say it's independent.
God simply has the best view of it, and then He can communicate that towards us. But that's still not saying that God defines what is right and wrong. That's saying that God has the best view of what is right and wrong, and God then commands, and God then kind of suggests to us, kind of, he tells us to do things that are right and wrong. You see?
Yeah, according to Him, and this is where we, as the faithful or the believers, believe that God has this ability to say what is, or dictate what is right and wrong, as opposed to you and I. If our morality is arbitrary, you can be a Hitler, and I could be a very good person, but then we're none the different. We're all running on our own arbitrary morality, and I can't tell you mine is right and you can't, or my morality is right and you can't tell me your morality is right. This is what arbitrary means. When we say absolute, we mean there are no other possibilities. There's only one possibility, and we say that one possibility, it belongs to the Creator who knows the creations best, and it is for Him, as He is Al-Qadi, He's the judge. So it is for Him to be able to dictate to us what is good and what is bad. And we cannot judge the creation. This is another point that I made. Cannot judge the Creator by their own morality, which differs. It is for the Creator to judge His creation by that which He deems is right and wrong.
All right. Yeah, I think yeah, okay. I'm are there any other kind of topics that you want to talk about?
Okay, cool. So it's like we're shooting through these topics quite quickly, and it's nice to actually. It's quite refreshing to see that you can concede, or at least know.
Oh shit! I never heard James say nothing about conceding.
Yeah. To be fair, like
the first one.
No, yeah. I concede that regarding the first one, I think there's a range of possibilities about it, and I can see that it's possible, and so I won't bring that particular piece of evidence for kind of the teachings of Islam and Muhammad's advocating kind of unjust treatment of non-Muslims. I can bring stronger pieces of evidence instead.
You saying
okay?
You don't seem enthusiastic to want to hear about them.
Oh, about the others? No, yeah. I wanted to finish.
What do you think? What do you think about James's motivations for even doing all of this research? He's been referred to as a hate preacher a lot on last Sunday.
I don't know, man. I don't know. They say that ideology is often worse than the action itself. Me personally, I didn't watch the whole video. I just don't see James as that person, as in he concedes when there's other possibilities. I did think his approach was a bit different, but usually he's quite mildly mannered.
He said he's in league with Tommy Robinson. That
Hamza,
I don't believe that.
There's a little explanation for that, which is that none of the videos record how the conversation with Adnan started, and so I imagine the first thing I asked Adnan is, Adnan, why did you say in a lecture after a lecture of Abdullah Faisal in 2003 that why did you advise Muslims to support him? And so I just asked him that kind of very calmly. I didn't like start kind of shouting, look at the evidence. But it's after I asked that, kind of it very quickly became the kind of atmosphere where kind of
confrontation.
Yeah, and confrontation, or he had like there was one person in particular who was like kind of quite a sort of dedicated heckler, and you know, it wasn't like this kind of atmosphere where we're giving each other like pretty much equal times to talk and make our points and you know, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Without neither of us are kind of preaching kind of on and on and on and just like, you know, or kind of going like, you know, other kind of things that kind of prevent good verbal intercourse, as Leon might say.
There was one point you mentioned about hadith. Every ism, schism, and everything. There's multiple readings of that statement. That's what generally history is. Is you have a problem with hadith or anything? Would you like to explain your position on hadith?
Well, I mean, it's related to kind of the hadith and the Quran as well, in that what I'd say is like the Quran and hadith reports have such a wide range of teachings and messages concerning non-Muslims, ranging from kind of advising to be kind and just to them on one hand, to on the other hand calling them unclean, calling them the worst of creatures, comparing them to livestock, saying that they should be driven out of the Arabian Peninsula, saying that qisas should not apply the same to them as to Muslims. And so as a result, I do not consider the Quran and Hadith to be a good and reliable source of moral guidance, because you basically kind of need to already have a principled, functioning moral compass, and then use that to judge whether to judge which teachings are bad and like whether to ignore them, or kind of think, or kind of and which kind of teachings to kind of acknowledge, these are the ones that should be kind of continued into the future and actually followed. But in that case, kind of it wouldn't be the body of Islamic teaching that's kind of causing you to be a good person. Like what would be doing the work in that case would be your principled, functioning moral compass. So
where'd you get that from?
Well, like what I could compare it to, for example, is if someone so this kind of moral compass would be kind of guided by principles like treat others the way you would like to be treated, minimize human suffering or minimize suffering in general, that kind of thing. And but if on the other hand you approach Islam for guidance and you kind of come towards it as a totally open book, you know, like with no kind of preconceived notions, no and you just kind of like maybe turn off or don't engage with that moral compass, and you just look at the Islamic scripture and say, you know, whatever it says, kind of like, you know, lay it on me. This, like, I'm just going to use this for guidance. So if you do that, and you kind of in the process get it drilled into your head, things like do not follow your desires, but only follow the Quran and Sunnah, and that sort of thing, then I think the outcome is quite likely to be harsh and discriminatory, or it might be kind of a coin flip, whether you kind of end up going down the kind of Salafi Wahhabi kind of strain of Islam, which has this doctrine, I don't know if you know about it, called al-wala wal-bara, with kind of which translates to kind of loyalty and disavowal, and kind of draws on this idea of you know, you must always kind of either love for everything, you should either love for the sake of Allah or kind of hate for the sake of Allah. And so a part of this kind of al-wala wal-bara doctrine is kind of strictly discouraging you from forming friendships with non-Muslims, or the only way, or like kind of maybe with an exception of if you want to convert them, let's say. And so I think kind of, and so I think that's a problem that kind of this is kind of one of the reasons why I don't think that Muhammad was a prophet and the Quran was from God.
Okay, so this is based, for example, let's say the initial hadith which you showed up. One of your arguments was that perhaps if it had more text explaining the hadith, then you could understand what the hadith was meant to be. And like others you mentioned, I think the first one was clean, and you mentioned about 3 or so in a row.
Yeah, the ones that I mentioned are generally drawn from the Quran, like the things about being unclean or being the worst of creatures or like livestock, or and then I mentioned a couple from hadith, like kind of
Yeah.
instructing that non-Muslims should be driven out of the Arabian Peninsula, and that Qisas should not apply the same for Muslims as non-Muslims.
So when it says unclean and the word, what's it referring to as?
It's referring to disbelievers.
Physical unclean? Disbelievers are physically unclean, or physically the worst of? What is it that it's actually referring to?
So the unclean is saying the disbelievers are unclean, so don't let them come into the the place of worship at Mecca after this year. So
Okay, but what does this mean? As in, this unclean, is this something which is physical? This is the question I wanted to know.
No, I mean, well, there is
really.
I'm thinking. So that this particular ayah is referring to kind of sort of spiritual uncleanliness, I guess, or uncleanliness in their belief. However, there are other. You've just kind of reminded me of other kind of bits of Islamic teaching within the kind of Islamic tradition of, for example, whether kind of non-Muslims are unclean, in that kind of there are kind of scholars who arrive at the conclusion that it's that kind of non-Muslims are unclean, such that you can't eat food that they've prepared. Like I have definitely kind of come across some rulings of that nature, and so I think.
So James, can we do like because I know you've got a lot to say, but sometimes you stray into so many topics. It's like I'm trying to chase your tail. Just trying to answer.
No, and I don't want it to be like I'm not mentioning all these examples to kind of like give you this impossible load that. And now I'm not saying okay, now you kind of debunk all of them right now. And I was just like trying to sort of give an overview of how I think even you would admit that it's possible. I mean, given that even kind of Muslim scholars have arrived at kind of quite unjust teachings and kind of taken unjust messages from the kind of text that I'm referring to. So the point is to make that kind of this body of teachings has kind of mixed results, I'd say, in effectively encouraging sort of very
so you've given quite a lot on the plate, so let me just chase whatever I can, and I'll try to group them together and deal with it. So the first few contentions you mentioned, unclean, worst of creation, this is all in reference to the belief of a person, not the physicality of a person. You mentioned about for example, the believers themselves are not allowed to do certain ritual things, such as touching the Quran, unless they have a state of ablution. If you are in a state of uncleanliness, like physical uncleanliness, whether you jumped in mud or so, you have to clean yourself before you present yourself to prayer as well. So there are many things which the believers are also told to be clean off, and this ablution is what cleans them. Like Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, whilst he was a non-Muslim, before he could touch the Mus'haf, his sister said that you are not clean, meaning here that you're not spiritually clean. So Umar, he cleansed himself by ablution, which again is symbolic more than anything. It's not a physical thing. It's more so symbolic. And then he read the Quran. So we have to understand what we're talking about: unclean, the worst of creation, an animal. If you have a king, for example, and I threw this example to you, the king has two subjects, two citizens. One is loyal to him and one is not loyal to him. Which one is that king going to have preference over, or two? It's going to, without doubt, be the one who is loyal to him. And this is a very small concept of what God is to his creation. If we were created by God, our loyalty is subject to him. And if we don't, then he has the right to say we are no good in our creation, because in Islamic theology, we believe that God created us for the sole purpose of his worship. If we do not attain the objective, then we have failed.
How can God blame us for not reaching the conclusion that there is only one God and Muhammad is his final messenger, when the evidence for that isn't very solid. It isn't certain.
Yeah, well, this is the discussion we need to have.
So what I mean is, like, you can't sort of blame us and compare us to disloyal subjects unless the evidence is kind of open and closed, or like unless we absolutely kind of
Okay, let's assume
proven,
this is now gone into a slightly another discussion, but let's
Yeah.
assume now, like Abraham, as you say in the anglicized way, he saw his father making idols with his own hands, and his father used to worship those idols. Now, logic dictates there that something is not going on. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he asks his father, Azar, who do you worship? And his father said, these idols. And then Ibrahim alayhi salam, a young boy, he says, why do you worship these idols if you are the one who are making these idols? So logically, we can deduce that idolatry doesn't make sense using the argument in the Quran, which Ibrahim, peace and blessing, put forward to his father. It doesn't make sense to worship that which you created. It cannot be the one that created you. So using this kind of
those idol worshippers would say, oh no, I didn't like invent the god, rather I'm kind of inspired by the divine presence, and they're making their kind of representation known to me, and so I'm just like giving a shape to something that exists, to the true god of the true gods of the world. And I'm not inventing the gods, I'm just like giving sort of a physical representation of it, because I've been inspired by their divine presence.
I understand in some religions that's what they do. There are peculiar forms they take, like the phallic form, to represent the god of sexuality, and then they thereafter worship that phallic form. But reasonably and rationally, and it seems like you're calling to rationality here, but then you're losing your rationality there, as in these people.
Those people. I don't believe that kind of having certain belief in kind of supernatural things is rational in any case. But I'm just saying it's not a fair representation of their belief system to say, like, that you've invented your
no, I'm talking about a specific one. I'm speaking about the specific idol worship. There are other types of idol worships as well, which are very similar,
sure.
very, very, very similar to that. But this is how you deduce which one is the true religion or which one is the true concept of God. There are other things such as the innateness that you have in every single society. There's always, even after secularism, after extreme secularism or communism, you find that the people often revert to a concept of belief in a god, and usually it's one god. So most people don't deny that. Even if you look at all of the polytheistic societies, the pantheons of Greek in Rome, they always believed in one deity that was greater than the other. For example, if you look at the Trinity of the Greeks, which had Jupiter was the main god, but followed underneath him were two other gods. This was their trinity. And in Islam, we say that there's only one God completely. So anyway, a person has to have the ability to rationalize and deduce which is false. Sorry?
There's a kind of an important thing to note about kind of the history of religion here is that if you look at kind of human records, what you find is that, like, the earliest kind of signs of worship and religion are kind of animist and polytheistic beliefs, where people have like different idols for different gods, like a god of fertility and a god of kind of the harvest, or like that sort of thing. And so like the question arises to me that if humans truly were kind of created, and were created with a human nature that makes it natural for them to only believe in one god, then kind of how is it explained that kind of all our kind of earliest evidences seem to show kind of that human societies around the world kind of were polytheistic, and kind of monotheism first seen, I think the earliest records I know of it happening were in kind of ancient Egypt, whereas there are many records of like worship going on before then. And so, like, I don't think you can really make the claim that it's part of human nature to believe in monotheism when kind of the state of humanity in its early form, kind of en masse, what was not kind of monotheistic. Kind of if it were their kind of human nature to believe in monotheism, then you'd have found kind of that the societies were and their records would be monotheistic.
Okay, cool. So we've kind of jumped now to the topic of we're slightly jumping from topic to topic.
Yeah, and sorry about that, but like it's
okay.
I mean,
it's interesting nonetheless.
You did mention kind of like you did make this claim as you did kind of make a claim about a little bit of evidence of kind of, you know, you said people have this sort of belief for monotheism even in kind of atheist societies, and so kind of what rebuttal to that point.
Yeah, sure. The only thing is then it just kind of cascades into 5 different other topics, and even I try to address each of those, it cascades further and branches forever ad infinitum. But just going back to that, in many societies we do actually, if you read records of history, for example, in the Arabian Peninsula, because I'm aware of this literature, it mentioned that many of them were, in fact, all of them were monotheistic until someone called Amr ibn Luhay, and they actually labeled the name of the person, so we know at the onset of polytheism in Arabia started from this one person, because he went to another place, I think it was a travel to Syria, and he saw the gods that they worship, and he brought one back. I think the name was Hubal, and thereafter they started worshipping that god aside from the one god they believed in. So even the Quran testifies about this. If you ask the people who created you, they would say God. But the problem is, it says aktharuhum, that the most of them, they believe or they worship or set aside partners other than Allah. So they believe in one God, but they also believe in loads of other gods. Like the Greeks I mentioned, they have pantheons, but at the top of each pantheon there's one God. Even in Hinduism, they believe in one main God, and thereafter demigods. But going back to the original topic before
I'm sorry, I won't do that again. You're right.
It's
a bit unfair of me, because like you know, you're in a position where you're trying to kind of defend your beliefs and kind of raise new topics. Like, so sorry about that.
No, it's interesting. It makes for great discussion. It's just hard to kind of keep up with each of them, because okay, so we're talking about perspicuity, the unclarity of text. Now, I'm not sure if you had any chance to read about oral societies, about how they operated and passed down information. Have you read anything by any chance?
Of what kind of societies?
Oral traditions and oral societies. Prior to the recording
not really. Not really.
Okay, so information generally, the primacy of information was always that it was spoken. Even writing down, when it did develop, it was frowned upon because they believed it took away from living memory. So if, for example, you wrote something down and you were alive, it would be better for me to go to you rather than your text, because you'd be able to clear up any misconception, give a background, give the context and everything. And this is the tradition that we carry on in Islam, that the oral tradition is the supremacy, whilst the written is there to aid the oral transmission. So when you look at the Quran constantly makes reference to following the Prophet, obeying the Prophet. And this has to refer to nothing other than the Sunnah, which is the way of the Prophet, the way what he said, what he did, and what he accepted. So when we pick up a book like Bukhari, and this is where you were talking about the unclarity of Bukhari, of the hadith compilations, we have to understand also how was that book written, what was the intent written. Bukhari didn't write to explain the hadith. This is just a compilation, a gathering of hadith. What you want is a book that explains this hadith. So you would go to something like Ibn Hajar's sharh of this hadith, his explanation of these hadith. So what tends to happen in the Western world, and Christian polemics, I've noticed this recently, is that they don't understand that the hadith books are just the body of text with no explanation. What these books were, the reason they were written was that they're meant to accompany the scholar, and the scholar explains the hadith, and the student who's inquiring, he asks questions about these hadiths, so he understands fully. And then there's something called tahammul ilm, which is the carrying down of information. If I, for example, had written down information that you had said, I still would not be able to convey or transmit that information unless you had given me permission. So I literally would have to sit at your feet as a teacher and write down, record what you had said, and you would check this information thereafter. My name would be recorded on a register, which also could be checked to see that if I was legitimately your student or not. This is classical knowledge, by the way, and how the transmission
Okay,
of
that's pretty
hadith
interesting.
come. Yeah,
So can I just like, to make sure I kind of understand
on topic.
Yeah, this is the exact same topic. There's just to make sure I understand you correctly. So
Yeah, sure.
if so, like for example, Abu Huraira would remember a situation he was in, and he'd tell his students about that situation, and he'd tell them kind of the exact thing that Muhammad says, but then he would also tell his students about, you know, a lot about the context, and his student would remember that, and then and then the next student of Abu Huraira's student would kind of be passed down the actual quote, and he'd also find out the kind of overall kind of context through kind of a question and answer kind of session. And so this would kind of continue on until kind of Bukhari comes along, and he kind of gathers up you know, at least 30,000 or something, or like maybe 7,000. He gathers up a lot of these reports, plus a whole kind of, I know, let's say maybe a paragraph of explanation about kind of the context and stuff. But he only kind of records the kind of actual quote and a little bit of the context sometimes.
Very, very minimum, if he ever does put in context, but you would have to go to other scholars who actually devoted their time. Because the purpose of Bukhari compiling his book Sahih was, just as the title indicates, that these were the hadith which he deemed as Sahih, as authentic. It did the intention was not to explain, but it is used also in jurisprudence, that book there.
So
in teaching jurisprudence.
So, same topic, but just following on.
Sorry, James. Sorry.
Still here. It's just about this process. So, to what extent have these accompanying explanations been preserved?
Sorry, say it again.
To what extent have the accompanying explanations kind of been preserved?
I haven't looked into this one too much, but if it's okay, could we just finish the hadith, the preservation of the hadith, really briefly, and then we can get on to other.
Oh, sorry, I was just like, because
I know you're.
Can you tell me like what the name of this overall topic is, so I could look into it later? Like
we're talking about the preservation of hadith. You can check anything I'm saying. You can check anything I'm saying online. If you need anything specific, sure. Like for example, the shar. Just write explanation of hadith, and you read about Bukhari's Sahih, and you will realize that it's just a compilation of hadith. He's not actually explaining the hadith in his book Sahih. So we have to understand what a book is before we read it. And this is one of the problems that many people are having in the West, that we've lost attachment to how to read a book. We have to understand its audience, when it was written, why it was written, how it was written, what was the political situation before we actually read it.
There's one informative lecture on the science of hadith.
It's like going from here to there.
Yeah, sorry, but it's just because this is kind of very new to me. Like, I hadn't heard about this.
This is why.
I'm saying, I log on to on the COE channel. Go, look for the discussion between Raj and Adnan Rashid. Still, you see the science of hadith conversation they have there still.
Okay.
Listen, you see, when we come, the Muslims, and we're saying our hadith is different from history, it's very true. For example, what was the last history book you've read, James? Or article that you can recall, if you do recall? I'm not. It's not a gotcha catch question.
Kitab Tabakat al-Kabir.
Okay, what was the, let me rephrase the question. What was the last non-Muslim history book that you had read?
The Cambridge Histories of Africa.
Okay, they came. Okay, so who had written that?
It has several authors for different
It's
sections.
okay. Well, let me just get to the point. Otherwise, this question's just going to keep going on forever. The point is that when we pick up, for example, the Bible, we have a book. We don't know who had written it. In fact, we don't know if there was an. Let's start from the beginning. We don't know the witnesses to the event. We don't know those who had transmitted this information to other peoples. We do not know who had actually written it. We don't know who had then copied those written testimonies, and we then don't know who had compiled these written testimonies. So there's a series of questions and question marks to the validity of these persons who are transmitting in terms of their retention, their recollection of information, as well as their transmitting of it, which is enormous. And in hadith, however, which is different from history again, and this is why we reject sometimes the reading of certain history books like Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, and so on. And we all often point towards hadith, because hadith come with a chain of transmission where we know someone had witnessed an event, and we know that person's personal life in terms of their memory retention, their honesty and their integrity and their character, and how committed they were to preserving something. And we would grade them with, I think off the top of my head, 10 different categories, going from Suduq, which is very trustworthy, all the way to Kadhab, which is liar. And some people would they would deem their own relatives as Kadhab, not as in liars, not in conventional modes of speaking, but in scientific terms, in the science of hadith, they would call their family members Kadhab, their inability to transmit information correctly. So, unlike other pieces of history, we know who witnessed it, who passed it down to who, and we know each of their characters. We know as in where they were born and who they interacted. We can cancel out which is a fake and a forgery, because we can look at their biographies, and again that has been scrutinized as well, the biographies, and we can say this is impossible for this one to have met that person. So this hadith is then graded and said whether it's weak, is mawquf, is completely cut off to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. I think one of the muqaddimas, which is the introductions to hadith, it mentions over 50 technical terms of or gradations of hadith, which makes it very, very difficult. And for someone like a Muslim to explain this to a person in a park, even now I'm having difficulty, because I'm trying to be as concise as possible in explaining how deep the knowledge of hadith is, and how much time the scholars spent on grading these hadiths, and making sciences such as ilm al-rujal, which were the biographies of the narrators. So we would witness something, we would pass it down orally, we would write it, and then the writing component also had certain specificities. You were not allowed to write from me unless I gave you my permission as a scholar or a teacher. And after you finish writing, I would have had to check your book. And inside your book, and we still have these books preserved in our museums, if you check the front pages, you would see there a ijaza, or a license for you as a student to teach. Now, you wouldn't be able to teach unless I had given you that ijaza. Up to today, we still have this concept of ijaza or transmission license in our Quran as well as our hadith. And I have, I didn't know the topic was going to go this far, but I have some information on that. I'm not sure if you need me to send you that information. So that's why we as Muslims, we say that hadith is much, much stronger than history, because the sciences that were established earlier, much, much earlier, like how recently we've got something called textual criticism. Recently, you had Jonathan Mills when in the 17th century, when he had, I think, 100 manuscripts of the Bible, and he found within the 100 manuscripts 30,000 variations. This is the start if you may, of their textual criticism in the 17th century, 17 centuries after their actual text. In Islam, it started, initiated way, way before. And we have, if you look at the early texts that were written down in the time of the Prophet, because the Prophet ﷺ, he had over 70 scribes. Muhammad Mustafa al-Adhami, in his book Jam al-Quran, he makes mentions of these scribes. So they would write on behalf of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him. And some of these books were later absorbed into other books. We found the manuscripts of these early books and compared it to later books like Bukhari. And you can do linguistic analysis or corpus analysis. And we found that they are very, very similar to each other to show that there's a high level of preservation. Anyway, there's more, but it feels like this topic's going way beyond. The point that I was trying to make is, James, you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still. Yeah, I've been listening.
The point that I was trying to finish initially is that hadith were just written down, but it came with a person, and then there was a mode of transmission. And likewise, the Quran is the same thing. When the Quran was sent to the different provinces, it was sent with a reader. And it should be that the Quran was sent with, it should be said that a reader was sent to each province with a Quran, because the primacy or the prime thing was the oral transmission. And people in history... Yeah, sure.
Can I ask one more question about this topic?
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Also, before you do that as well, I'm gonna let couple more Muslims on the panel still, because they want a piece of James. I'm gonna let you talk for a minute and then bring them in.
Okay, so this is like a quick question: is that so for example, if Ibn Hajar, let's say, when he gives a bit of commentary on a hadith, like for example, when we were talking about the kind of Sahih Muslim hadith about do not initiate greetings with Jews and Christians, you quoted a bit of Ibn Hajar's comments. Does Ibn Hajar give a chain of transmission for that explanation? Because otherwise, how do we know that he's not just kind of giving his view on it, but it isn't actually based on evidence going back to Abu Huraira?
Yeah, I'd have to look at that. I've not looked at that particular one.
Because
but generally,
I've been suspecting that kind of the impression that you've given about this kind of explanation thing it isn't in reality as strong as the kind of explanation that you've given here, because I don't believe that these explanations will have been kind of preserved in the same way that kind of the actual kind of hadith that's actually written down in a kind of collection like Sahih Bukhari was preserved. So when I kind of see an explanation or a commentary by Ibn Hajar or something, or Qurtubi or something like that, unless they actually quote another piece of evidence, like another piece of historical evidence, I don't have any reason to kind of attach that much sort of significance to it. It could just be like their opinion,
Yeah, of course they use other parallel hadith. This is generally, even if you read tafsir, this is the same way. Each ayat of the Quran is always explained first and foremost by Quran, and then other hadith. So this is the methodology they use. But what we're saying here is that history is one thing, hadith is another. Hadith is a methodology which has been used with principles to determine which is most likely of the events to have happened. Whereas history, we tend to just pick up books and never actually challenge the narratives that we're seeing. And this was a thing of...
Historians do that, but they know that kind of the truth is probably inaccessible, and so there's only kind of a range of sort of all you can do is think about what the possibilities actually were, and so they kind of know their limitations. It's possible that
the method of history
it's possible that hadith sort of scientists, let's call them, like might be overestimating their ability to kind of know for certain who actually said what and kind of how trustworthy they were, especially given that some of the criteria for kind of deciding whether a transmitter in a chain was trustworthy is knowing how much they pray, for example. Like that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
criteria. If they're considered to be kind of an unjust person if they kind of have been known to kind of miss some prayers. Whereas like, you know, I think a historian would kind of say, be a bit skeptical and say, you're kind of reading into it a little bit too far here. Kind of, you can't make firm conclusions about someone, you know, just because they kind of haven't prayed or you've once seen them not praying.
Okay, so okay, I feel like I'm chasing your tail all over the place. Okay, so let's say, for example, now history. I understand that historians, they tend to look at things, but I'm saying that the method or the science of historical analysis came so late in the ages that it's almost impossible to reconstruct what happened before. But with Islamic sciences, this or the Hadith science, it happened so early on that the distance between the actual event and the science were much smaller and much more reliable than what we accept in history. So if you cannot accept the Hadith, then you cannot accept general history, because Hadith has a much more scrupulous method of examining history. I'll give you an example. Yahya bin Ma'in, he's a quite a well. You can write that down, Yahya bin Ma'in. And if you want a book on hadith, also you can go to Muhammad Mustafa al-Adhami. He's very good in explaining the transmission of information and the preservation of the Quran as well as hadith. So Yahya ibn Ma'in, who died in the year 233 after Hijrah. This is the Islamic calendar. So it's not too far off from the event. In order for him to check a hadith, this is after all of the sanad, after checking the books, after checking the ijazas, yeah. What he went to someone called, he wanted to read a book of Hamad to someone called Musa. Now Musa was a student of Hamad. So Yahya ibn Ma'in, he was asked by Musa, have you read these books of Hamad to anyone else? Meaning any other students of Hamad. So Yahya ibn Ma'in, he tells Musa, who's asking the question, yes, I've read them to 17 of Hamad's other students, and you, Musa, are the 18th person. So Yahya ibn Ma'in, he's saying, I've read this book of Hamad to 18 of his students, because obviously Hamad is no longer alive. So then the student, so Musa is saying to Yahya, why are you reading them to so many people and you're coming to me? So Yahya ibn Ma'in, he explains that Hamad committed errors and his students compounded a few more to this. By checking the errors between the students and Hamad, I can tell you where the error originated. In recent historical criticism, we understand this to be eclecticism. This is a recent science in Western sciences that's only taken place in the last few years. But this science was done by, and it's the same thing in geneticists, like phylogeny trees. You know how phylogeny trees work? We can establish relationships between species because, let's say, there's a change in the DNA. So we can trace down to where their ancestor was, and so on, until you come to the original. And this is what Yahya ibn Ma'in was doing in the year 200. But what we have in other books of history, even up to Shakespeare, they're doing this kind of approach or critical approach many years after Shakespeare. So it's almost impossible now to reconstruct what actually happened. Modern scientific approaches to the Bible include, for example, Bengal, where he said if you have two readings of a verse, he came up with the principle that the harder reading is most probably the most viable, meaning the most authentic. Yeah. This is Johann Albrecht Bengel in 1734. That's 18 centuries after the Bible was written. Now we're talking about Yahya bin Ma'in in 233 after Hijrah. He came up with a technique which he was able to find out, and it wasn't him that came up with the technique, sorry, apologies, but this is evidence to show what the Muslim scholars were doing at that time in order to find out where the mistakes in any hadith in wordings were. And that's why we have strong confidence in our scholars over historians of secular as well as other religious texts. And there's so much more I could say on this topic.
All right.
So much more.
Yeah. And, you know, you lending such credence to, so one of the conclusions that you're making is that if a report has been kind of classified as Sahih by most scholars, then there is kind of good evidence to believe that Muhammad actually said that. Would that be fair to say?
If we cannot believe in the hadith, then we can't believe in much of history. This is the reality. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, I mean, from my perspective, that's good, because I can show you like a number of kind of hadith of reporting Muhammad saying things that, you know, a prophet who's in touch with, you know, in kind of regular communication with God would not say, because they're kind of totally false, and so on and so forth. So maybe that'd be a good topic for another time, like to see, you defend kind of hadith not from a kind of moral perspective, but like from a kind of scientific and rational perspective.
So, I didn't follow.
So
do you want me to defend hadith from a rational point of view?
So like in the future.
Yeah,
I thought this is what we're doing just now.
Well, like, No. So what I'm saying is that
you're talking about the claims of some scientific claims.
Within certain hadith, kind of there are claims that kind of contradict science.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, and so I'm saying that, like, if you're at this point saying kind of, you know, if a hadith is classified as Sahih, then I have, you know, there is every reason to believe that Muhammad actually said that. And so if Muhammad actually said these things that kind of are totally contradictory to science, then that would, I think that would be kind of a source of evidence for him not to be an actual prophet.
Hamza. Hamza.
Huh? Yeah. I was about to go into another topic.
No, just a quick question. Is there any Sahih hadiths that you know of that you don't believe?
I don't know. I don't think, I very much doubt it, because I was explaining to James that Muslims, we're not like other religions, I don't want to name them, but we don't choose what we like and choose what we don't like. This is not something that we have a science in place that reduces our preferences, because with preference it comes bias, and then you're losing the scientific nature of sorting the information. So I may not like something according to my morality, but who suggested my morality is the standard?
What made you come to that? What made you come to the initial conclusion that anything that's rated Sahih you're gonna accept to be the truth?
No, the point that I was trying to say here is that if we're given history, then when it comes to, we don't really even challenge history. We accept it. Sometimes we look into opinion on another historian, but then when we look at it scrupulously, who witnessed the event? Who actually saw Shakespeare writing? Who actually saw someone copying? Which copyist copied the manuscript of Shakespeare?
That's why we agnostics though. But you're on this certified.
Okay, so now we go to the topic, another topic of agnosticism. What does agnosticism mean that you understand it to mean? Tell me, just briefly.
It's just professional fence sitting. Undecided.
Fence sitting. Undecided. Yeah? Undecided. Yeah. Okay.
Anywhere the wind blows, wherever the evidence leads you, that's where we're going.
Okay, wherever the evidence. So you reckon your evidence that you've been presented, like tonight, in regards to hadith and history, you reckon you're on the fence 50-50 or about hadith being stronger than history? Honestly.
No, not 50-50.
Exactly.
It depends,
so then
it depends on specific whatever the
so
specific
you're not really
you're
agnostic. You're not really agnostic.
I'm saying this is my understanding of what agnostic is.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is this whole concept of agnosticism as well. This is another topic we can go into as well. There's multiple things that we've only flirted with in this whole discussion. I feel like I'm chasing tails, but whole agnosticism, it assumes that you're 50-50, but nothing is ever 50-50. Sometimes evidence is much more compelling than other evidences. And if you're going with the evidences, then you have to go with which is more probable. And in this case, or in this discussion, we've shown the hadith is far more scrupulous than history. So if you were to reject...
Wait, where you get that about agnostic means 50-50? I ain't never heard that before still.
No, this is why I asked you for your definition, and you said you're
Yeah, I
on the
never.
fence,
Yeah,
undecided.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right? This is
yeah,
what
yeah.
you said. So people generally aren't
But
are only
I might be
undecided.
I might be leaning though. It could be on the
Ah,
fence and leaning one side, innit?
yeah. So really, you should man up and just make the choice. And
That's what people
like
say.
is
But
it?
No, but no, but if you
I
make
feel like people who make a choice and are unsure, I feel like
Yeah.
I feel like that's they're the ones who need to man up. You're
Yeah.
deciding on something
Okay.
that you're unsure about. I'm
Okay.
saying
This is.
if we're going with, we're
Mm,
gonna put our hands up and say we believe this is true, then yeah, say that. Like obviously, I'll live my life assuming that what's most likely is the truth, but I'm not gonna say that it's 100. That I'm 100% certain that that's what it is. Like I'm not gonna put all my chips in the bet. You know, like that.
but you do so.
one of the commentators made a good point, which is that historians don't kind of rule out sources if they kind of contradict a perceived kind of holy book, whereas presumably part of the methodology of hadith would be if if there's a report that contradicts the Quran, then you kind of throw it away or something like that, wouldn't you?
Okay. So yes,
It's a
because our
good point. Good
standard is
point.
different, and this is where we say that
Yeah,
we always have to go
we
back.
but like historians would say that it's not a kind of you know it's not a it's not certain that kind of the Quran is from God, and you know there isn't good evidence to kind of
So it goes back to what I'd originally said, James, that we need to discuss about the existence of God first and foremost, and then we need to decide about who the nature of that God. This is the primacy in our discussion, the most important thing. All else, and I mentioned maybe 4 times in this discussion, falls in place thereafter. You see, when we talk about modern historical methods, this takes on a secular basis. It assumes godliness, sorry, the lack of godliness. I'll give you an example. If we have two scriptures, and one of them, the later scripture, quotes the first source, historical method assumes the second source has copied the first source, whereas the theological approach would assume that this one is called a prophecy. But modern historical approach, it starts off with that secular approach, which doesn't allow for the space for God to be in that equation.
I think
Hello?
that's a little bit of a misrepresentation. Like, isn't it more that kind of they haven't seen any evidence of kind of God or prophecies? So the more likely explanation is that kind of the later source copied the earlier source.
Yeah, okay, so then there's no such thing as prophecy. When you look at historically, you can never actually claim such a thing as his prophecy.
Yeah, I don't think there is good evidence to believe that anyone kind of
But
in
this is where
history
this is where I was saying that we need to discuss about the validation of there existing a God. If we do that, all else falls in place. We can accept prophecy. Let me give you an example. Do you believe in? And we're kind of just veering off the main topic. Well, I don't know. This is the nature of our discussion. Do you believe in the supernatural?
No, not really. I mean,
Okay.
I haven't seen
Do
evidence
you?
yet, so
I think I've seen you in some of the.
I'm not certain that there is no such thing as the supernatural, but I don't have any kind of positive belief that there is.
Okay, so
I'm
sorry,
agnostic.
I had surgery not too long ago. My back is killing me.
I hear that.
Yeah, it's terrible. So anyway, the point, for example, I've lost track of what we were saying.
Kind of prophecy you're talking about, or the
Prophecy,
supernatural is what you just said.
supernatural.
You can
Okay.
ask him if he's scared of the dark because he don't believe in the supernatural.
No.
Okay, so I've seen you in some scientific debates, so I know you have some basis. Okay, you believe in, from what you understand, yeah. Do you believe in the Big Bang?
Yeah, I have a
Singularity.
good degree of belief in it.
Okay,
Yeah, good degree of belief in that.
great. So you follow that model.
Yeah.
And this is the same thing we say with hadith in it. You have to have a good degree of, you can have a good degree of belief in it and you can follow it just as you follow this model. But that's a side note. Okay, so when it comes to the Big Bang, do you think that this movement created itself, or how do you think the movement occurred?
It seems kind of it doesn't seem very likely to me that it created itself.
Okay, so nature, is that a property of the universe, or does it exist outside the universe?
Like the universe, as I understand it, kind of
Mm-hmm.
normally means everything that exists.
Okay.
Within the context of the theory of the Big Bang, though, kind of universe is quite often used to mean what results from a Big Bang.
No, nature. The topic is about supernatural. So I'm saying nature. Nature, what we understand it to be, is everything within the
Oh yeah.
universe, space, time,
Okay.
matter. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
So
Sorry.
the nature doesn't exist outside of the universe. So if I told you what's around that corner, would you tell me more corner?
I I
You wouldn't.
I wouldn't know what's behind the corner.
Excellent, but you wouldn't say more corner, right?
What do you mean by more corner?
Okay. So if I told you, for example, just going back to the actual. If I told you what's beyond nature, what's outside of the universe, can you tell me more nature?
No.
Something which is
If you're
supernatural, right?
yeah,
Excellent. So
there
you believe in
there
the
would have to be.
supernatural.
Well, if you're defining the universe as everything that exists, then the only thing that could be outside of the universe would be something that kind of doesn't hold this kind of property of existing in the way that we understand the word.
The prefix super. Do you recall what the prefix super means? It means to
Above.
be above. Yeah, that's right. Above something. So when we say supernatural, we're saying above nature.
Yeah.
So if there's an agent or cause that exists beyond this universe that we know, then that agent is supernatural. So you technically, because you said something did cause that motion of the universe, the Big Bang, this is what you said before. And time is a property of that universe. So this thing that causes the Big Bang and is supernatural is also beyond time, which means it's timeless. And we can keep on going. Matter is a property of the universe. That thing which created the universe, which is timeless, which is supernatural, can also be called immaterial. And the argument goes on and on and on.
Yeah, but you need to be we need to be kind of careful, like you need to be careful, like making sure that you're sort of making it clear whether you're using universe to mean all that exists or everything that resulted from the Big Bang. Because because scientists often say, like in the context of when they're making statements about the Big Bang theory, they quite often use the universe to mean kind of what results from a Big Bang. And so there could have been, like, for example, other universes, as in other sort of things that result from other Big Bangs that we kind of don't know of. That's a sort of inaccessible,
A
like, outside.
multiverse.
Yeah, something like that. And so in that case,
But then the question
but
still goes down to, where did this multiverse come from?
yeah,
You still have the same problem.
well, but then you could say, like, it's always existed.
Okay, so now the steady state theory.
Well, not steady state theory, but not as it applies. You could call it that, but not as it applies to kind of our current universe, because we're not saying that the galaxies have always existed and they're kind of just popping up kind of to fill up
This is
the
what I'm
space.
saying. This whole multiverse theory, actually, if you read about it, you see that it's not as substantiated as it's almost a cop out to reduce the possibility of a god existing.
No, it's something that scientists, like, kind of, examine without kind of a.
Examine without any evidence,
Well,
right? They have
no, I was going to say
formulas.
without a kind of theological aim. Like people working on cosmology kind of are both Christians, agnostics, kind of all sorts of faiths. So, and I don't really know enough about physics to be making kind of that many firm claims about sort of the theory of the Big Bang. And it's a little bit dangerous to kind of approach the subject with this kind of mindset whereby we think that we can reach conclusions or true conclusions about how the world is just by kind of thinking about what we think its properties would be, like how natural philosophers used to. Because, like, before science kind of was done in terms of experiments, people used to do natural philosophy, where they kind of considered what the properties of the universe must be according to their kind of intuitions and, like, logical inferences based on these kind of intuitions and assumptions, and they reached ideas like kind of, oh, the world is divided into four elements: earth, wind, and fire and water. So, like, as a methodology for finding out about the true sort of state of reality, I'd say that performing natural philosophy is a less reliable way of going about it than kind of performing science. So kind of it can be tempting to think, oh, we can.
So
we can
do you think
it can be tempting to think that we can find out or rule out or make conclusions about how the universe came to be just by sitting here thinking by ourselves. But in reality, it's like kind of better to leave these things to actual kind of cosmologists who are more in touch with the evidence available and know more about quantum field theory.
I agree with you to a degree. The only problem is I think you're going fishing with the dog leash. You're using the wrong tools for the wrong exercise. I don't think you can use science in a place where science is not to be used. For example, you ruled out philosophy. This is what you just said, in place of science. But then science is just an explanation of the natural world. We're saying that God, or that agent that created the universe, which is immaterial, timeless, etc., so it lays in a place where science has no premise. So you cannot use scientific tools to discern about God. I don't think so. I think a lot of it is because in a holistic from a holistic point of view, yes, we have science, we have rational, we have history, we have all of these, but all of these have limitations, and we have to understand their limitations. Science cannot explain multiplicities of things, such as metaphysics, the mind, ethics, good and bad, aesthetics, what is ugly and what is beautiful. Even the we have what's it called, the basis of science is based on suppositions. Every discipline has its suppositions. I forget the word. Oh, bloody hell. Axioms. Science has axioms. And many of these axioms are challenged. Many of these are debated upon. So, but we can still do science. We can still do it. It doesn't mean that we can't do science just because we don't know the actual how. We still have these axioms, and we just assume them to be correct in order for us to go forward. So yeah, all of these tools do have limitations, and some of them we can never actually even answer. I think someone in the park came the other day, started talking about the limitations of mathematics as well. Anyway, the onus is not always on the believer to explain why God exists. The onus is also on the non-believer. So what would be the arguments that God doesn't exist?
Well, for example, you could make an art, like, I know one thing that I've been like throwing around is that if there was a benevolent God, then it seems like the kind of the universe that he's constructed for us, for kind of his creations, necessarily involves us being cruel to each other, like kind of eating each other, and in order to survive, because humans aren't the only creations that can suffer. Like animals can suffer, and yet for much of existence, for much of history, kind of we've had to inflict great pain on animals in order to kind of survive. And for much of the animal kingdom, that will always be the case. And so I wonder, kind of like which better explains the kind of evidence, or which explanation better explains the evidence that kind of that there is a benevolent God, and he decided to make the universe such that kind of we had to act in kind of quite harsh ways in order to survive and avoid suffering, or that kind of the kind of creator of the universe is either not benevolent, or kind of there is no creator of the universe. We just have a physical
God made God. You can't use that argument because God made animals to be our property. for our use.
Yeah, but but like but I don't see what reason there is to accept that though, because like, you know, there's every evidence that we evolved from those same animals, and so those animals kind of clearly have the propensity to suffer, and so
That's a lie. That's a lie. Adam and Eve.
Okay, so again, it goes back to the topic of morality and free will. Now, had God chosen, this is an argument which is known as the free will argument. God gave us free will to exercise our morality. He gave us the propensity to do good, or at least know good. So we have this moral compass within us, but we've been given free will to do good or bad. So bad circumstances do arise. Now, if God had wanted only for good to exist on the universe, then it would mean that he would have taken away our free will and made us only as agents, robots. But then it would defeat the whole purpose of us being here. And then it would be here, you go straight into heaven, you go straight into hell.
We said we can't have choice without good and bad.
Sure.
We can't have choice.
He said this of course. If God made us only good, how can if he take away that would mean he takes away our free will.
I don't understand how that works. Can we have good and free will at the same time?
We're talking about between good and evil. These are the two choices we're talking about. Now, if God took away the choice to be bad, then we can only ever do good, right?
Yeah.
And good doers go where?
But if you could argue that there's probably something else other than good and bad that we don't know about yet that we might experience when we go to heaven.
In terms of morality, what else is there other than good and bad?
If all we got is good, then that's all we got in it. But we still can have choices to live our life and only do good. We can just do different things, innit?
Yeah, and the question is that you can give someone the ability to be kind of to act kindly or act in a cruel way and inflict suffering. You can give people free will in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
There's another step beyond that. If you create the environment such that it effectively forces you to be cruel and inflict suffering, or if you give people the human nature such that kind of they have these behavioral urges to kind of do these things. Like, for example, I know, like, if just looking at looking at sort of the psychology that kind of people seem behaviorally predisposed to. A good example is like that there's research that's been done on babies where they kind of do an experiment where they kind of show a sort of finger puppet show, like a little puppet act, where kind of first of all they kind of ask the baby like what kind of not a like newborn baby, but like a very young infant. They ask them what kind of a sweetie or what kind of cereal they prefer. Okay, and after they know that, kind of they show some babies kind of a variety of different kind of plays. Like they show some of them, they introduce the kind of finger puppets to the baby and kind of show that this finger puppet likes a different cereal from the baby, and they show and to other babies they kind of show that the finger puppet likes the same cereal as the baby. Okay, and then like for the next stage, like kind of they show a play on this kind of puppet act where the puppet, which has been introduced as either liking or disliking the cereal that the baby likes, is hit by another puppet, and basically babies enjoy seeing a puppet which has different taste in cereal and differs for them in such a kind of insignificant way. They kind of are much more likely to enjoy seeing that puppet kind of be punished harshly based on such a trivial difference. And so this kind of shows very early on in our kind of natural psyche that we have this predisposition towards tribalism, and it shows kind of an immoral behavior that kind of we seem to be behaviorally predisposed to. And I haven't done a particularly good job of summarizing the experiment they did. I can instead kind of post a link so that people can like watch the evidence themselves. But
what's the point that you actually make it?
Because the point is, if you know that kind of humans are behaviorally predisposed to have this kind of immoral tendency towards tribalism, and therefore tribalism is kind of like the overall behavior of racism. It can manifest as racism. If you know that
in its extreme, yes.
If you know that humans have this tendency towards tribalism, is that more explained by having a benevolent God who kind of puts this immoral behavior into us, or is it better explained by we've arisen through a process of evolution? I'd say it's better explained by, the theory of evolution than it is by kind of a benevolent God kind of putting this undesirable facet of human nature into us.
James, okay, so evolution. Again, we're jumping to another another topic. So evolution.
You asked me for like an example of
a
reason to believe that there might not be a God.
So evolution, what does that actually explain? It explains how A got to B, but it doesn't explain biogenesis, how life came upon Earth. You'd have to, if you're talking scientifically, resort to pantheism, that life came from outside the universe on a rock and then started, or the theory that the life began in the depth of the ocean under extreme heat, or the what do you call it, the soup theory, primordial theorem. Yeah, you have to go to one of these ones. Evolution just explains how A became B, but doesn't explain how A got there in the first place. So I don't think that's a strong argument which you've proposed. But in terms of one second. It's because you mentioned so many things. If we now talk about innatism, these features that you have, you're born with, or you're predisposed to something, this is evidence that there is a God. As in, if there were no God, there will be complete randomness. The concept that there being laws and there being system points to a creator which has intelligence. If no creator existed, you couldn't expect to see moral laws, universal laws, any form of laws. You'd expect to see complete disorder, but the very fact that we see order is proof that a God exists and not random sequences of events.
That sounds like an assumption. Like you're assuming that if there weren't a God, then there would be absolutely no structure. But why couldn't logically?
What does evolution say?
Simply be.
Well, the evolution suggests we are just a sequence of random events.
But you need to understand it sort of a little bit more sophisticatedly than that. Kind of basically, a mutation might happen like totally randomly. Okay. But then like kind of whether or not that mutation either helps the animal survive or hinders the animal surviving and reproducing, kind of that mutation will either kind of become more common in the next generation, or it will become less common. So
you're talking about innatism, the predisposition you were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, how are you predisposed to anything?
Like it seems decently likely that it happened through evolution, like behaviors being predisposed through evolution.
Okay, so, go on, expand.
Sorry?
Expand, go on.
Yeah, so for example, kind of after you've kind of gone through abiogenesis, where you kind of have just molecules kind of reacting with each other until you get a kind of a ribozyme, sort of a molecule that can replicate itself. And then from that, you kind of get the first single-celled organisms. Then after kind of, evolution until you get to multicellular organisms, at that point, you could evolve kind of sense organs, and then you could evolve neurons, which work in a kind of concert with each other, so that you have like a kind of a very primitive brain. And then at that point, kind of different genes can affect how that brain kind of forms and how that brain functions. And so then you could have you can see kind of then it's easy to imagine how kind of genes can affect behavior, because for example, we've found several genes that do affect behavior already. There's a type of there's one gene called the MAO-A gene, which affects how a particular type of neurotransmitter is broken down, and it kind of is very is pretty strongly correlated with aggression. A particular form of that gene is, and so that's the story. That's how you go from abiogenesis to kind of organisms to organisms with behavior.
Can I slow you down? Just going to the beginning. You're talking about more or less the primordial soup theory, Stephen Miller's experiment, where he got what he believed were the early Earth's composition, and he placed it in a jar where he heated it up, and he waited for some kind of amino acid to bind or form and bind with another one. The problem is, all that shows is that you need intelligence to create life.
Why?
Because the scientist was required to make that life or that amino acid come together in the primordial soup experiment.
How do you know that the conditions of the early Earth might not have been similar enough to kind of allow the molecules to react together?
Sure. Well, you can actually see Stephen Miller's primordial soup theory has actually been, I don't want to say disproved. What's the word?
It's been discredited. But
because of the early.
But there have been like kind of successors to it.
Yeah. So this has been discredited because we now know the early Earth's composition isn't anything like what he assumed. But even then, assuming it was like that, and his experiment is correct, all it shows is that you needed a scientist or an intelligent being to create life. That's all that experiment shows. It doesn't show a random occurrence. It shows that an intelligent agent, a scientist, created amino acids, and even then amino acids joined to other amino acids to form by peptide bonds to then form proteins. The chance of that is astronomical. Hello?
But that chance kind of is so sensitive to the initial conditions and given that we don't actually know that kind of carefully what the initial conditions of these early Earth experiments were, we can't say for certain like how likely it is that amino acids might form in that way, because for example, like if you have a surface, if you have a surface like on a clay, a flake of clay, that flake of clay can potentially have a surface such that it causes certain reactions to be much more likely. And
I agree, but that just shows that you need intelligent scientists or intelligent being in order to promote those conditions.
No, but what if those conditions?
We're saying randomness.
What if those conditions could have simply arisen through the unconscious laws of nature?
Okay, where does the laws of nature come from? This is the whole contention that I'm making today. Whether you look at DNA or physics or chemistry, all of them are governed by laws. Now, laws don't arise from anywhere. They come from a lawgiver.
No, but that's kind of that's kind of being a bit too literalist about the word law. Yeah. So when we say law of nature, we could just as easily call it the way nature is. And
the argument still stands. Where did the way come from?
But like, what reason? Like, we can't assume kind of that, because something's there must be a consciousness behind
that's why I don't understand as well. Why can't it just be as it is?
Yeah. Why can't it simply be like?
Because it would be random. It would be random.
When I
throw, because the universe. If I throw my pen up in the air, if I expected the universe to be a result of a random sequence of events, when I throw my pen up in the air, I wouldn't expect it to come down. In fact, I wouldn't know what to expect. But because there is law, and we observe law, we can assume that the pen is going to come down each and every single time, unless there is no gravity.
Keep on adding in random. I'm saying, why are you adding in random in the first place?
Because that's what law is. Law is that something sticks to a principle, a guide. Without laws,
but that don't assume that something must have created that law.
So where do laws come from?
Maybe they just exist as they are.
How do they exist as they are?
We don't know.
Your argument is random. That's the point I'm trying to make.
No,
I'm
No,
saying
you're
this,
saying random. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying
I'm saying random because I'm telling you your argument. That's why. If it doesn't,
no. But
it's
doesn't
like
make
it's
it
an
true though.
no.
But
But if
Hamza,
it's not,
when you say
it can't
random,
just be
you're
there.
presupposing something. When you
Okay,
say
so
random,
what
you're
are the options?
but when you so like when you say random, kind of it either means that kind of there's a range of possible outcomes, and each outcome is equally likely to happen. So that's one way of understanding random. Can you define what you mean when you say random, like quite precisely?
It's better for me just to say that I believe in laws, and laws are for me from a lawgiver. This is what my argument is. Whereas I want to know where we get these observable laws from. That's what all I wanted to get from me. From my point of view, this is my evidence as a theist that we have DNA, which is a language in and of itself. We have physics, which is governed by laws. In fact, the very fact that we believe in laws is how we get other disciplines such as jurisprudence. The early scientists in the 17th century, they believed in God, and hence they done science. This is, I think, called Merton's thesis. So because men expected law in nature, they believed in a lawgiver, and they were able to perform science, physics, mathematics,
Okay,
and other.
is your reasoning the fact that there is some consistency means that there must have been a god, and so if there was no god, then there would be no consistency, and absolutely
For,
anything
for,
could happen.
from my, no, from my point of view, if there's no God, nothing can happen.
Okay, isn't that like
Forget about
isn't
laws.
that a bit of an assumption? Like,
Well, this is
isn't
we
that
can
just
only
kind
go
of
by what we know. We can only. I
no,
don't
but
know
it
things
seems like
to
just kind
appear.
of an intuition. It seems like a human intuition because humans are born in a kind of a state where we obviously have a beginning, and we sort of observe and we think, oh, I haven't always been around. So we could very easily be kind of predisposed to certain intuitions about how things ought to be, and yet those intuitions might not be accurate to the way reality actually is. So when I hear
Well,
people say, okay, I have an intuition that there must be a creator. That isn't like a formal logical argument to me. That sounds like them just like
look,
asserting.
let's assume.
It
Let's
sounds
assume. Let's
like
go
them
by
just
the line.
asserting kind of an assumption.
Well, let's go by the line that you said that we always were. Yeah, this is one of the lines that Leon just supported you, and I
Yeah,
didn't hear you
it
contend that, so I'm assuming. Okay, so this is the only other option, right? That we only were, assuming infinity. Now, the problem with this, if there are infinite amount of sequences prior to us, we will never actually get to the present, because it will take an infinity of time to get to pass the past. To make this
can you
quite
break that
clear,
down a little
yeah,
bit?
sure. So now let's say if we think of a row of dominoes, if I tap one, the next one falls over, the next one's fall over, the next one fall over. Now imagine this taking an infinite amount of time before it gets to us. Will it actually get to us?
So is the kind of the assertion is that like kind of if an infinite if an infinite number of like distinct
Events
events
in the
kind of need
past.
to occur before the current event occurs,
Excellent.
then the current event will never occur.
Excellent.
Okay, so I can provide a counterexample to that. Okay,
Okay.
so listen to this. Okay, so like the position of let's say the position of an oxygen molecule in the air, kind of it's at its current position at its current time, and but its position will have been affected by events that occurred half a second ago. Okay, that's fair because like obviously oxygen molecules are constantly kind of bumping into each other and moving. So the state of the events that occurred half a second ago, like affected or kind of affected the position of the oxygen molecule at time t equals 0. And then if you think about the state of those events half a second ago, they will have been affected by events
half a second before
a
that.
quarter of a second ago. Okay, and those events will have been affected by events an eighth of a second ago. And so if you keep on like sort of subdividing the time, then you will get an infinite sequence of events that only go back 1 second in time if you sum the infinite sequence. It's like a geometric sequence. Okay,
but if you continue that for an infinite amount of time,
but this shows like it's an infinite chain of distinct events, but we've been able to kind of traverse it. Yeah. So like the fact that kind of there's been an infinite chain of distinct events, kind of that has been traversed. Okay, so like then
I'm not sure if I found that compelling. Honestly, from my point of view, I've never been able to get past the notion of, or the belief that there's an infinite amount of events before us. And even as you just explained, I still don't find that very persuasive. I don't think we'll ever get to the present point if there are infinite amount of sequences before us. It will take an infinite amount of time to pass them. And this is the very reason.
That's kind of like Zeno's paradox in a way. Then you're kind of like
It's
almost like saying that the rabbits will never kind of overtake the hare because
so be it.
But we know that the rabbit does overtake the hare eventually.
I honestly don't know about the rabbit and the hare, but what I'm saying is from
have a little look at the Zeno's paradox.
Send me the link for that. Send me the link for that. Maybe we go on to. But should we go back to the original? Let's go back to the original topic, the video of Adnan. How about that? That was more exciting.
So, you're the person kind of doing the interview. So yeah, sure, whatever you want.
Okay, cool. So because we've gone over so many things now, I think we've lost any sense of any single topic. You did Tommy. Your position on Tommy. What's your position on Tommy? That was mentioned.
So I was kind of so my experience of Tommy, like what I'd seen on him, most of what I'd seen were his kind of appearances on like sort of talk shows and things like that. And what I heard him saying on those kind of talk shows was generally kind of pretty reasonable and seemed to be like backed up by evidence. And so for a while, for a long time, and so at that point, I hadn't, like, for example, really seen what his marches were like or anything like that. I wasn't really aware. But like, what makes me kind of like change my mind about Tommy a little, significantly, is that there was this event where it showed it was like a sort of one of these viral Twitter videos of a Syrian refugee getting bullied by a white classmate while his hand was in a cast, and people were like talking about this, and then like Tommy kind of retweeted a claim that the white student was beating up the Syrian refugee because the Syrian refugee had harassed a girl or something like that, and Tommy kind of like sort of stated this. He kind of like pushed this forward, and but like in fact that claim was like not backed up by any evidence whatsoever. It's like totally made up, and so it kind of shows that he was kind of quicker to assume something bad, I think, just because that person was from a kind of from a Muslim background, and so that kind of for me kind of shows like a bias towards Muslims as people, which I would disagree with. Like I definitely disagree towards like having kind of irrational biases like that. And so kind of unless he kind of unless he kind of like sort of shows kind of a reform from that kind of I think it's bad. It's definitely bad to like have bias towards people based on that sort of thing. So that's my position on Tommy. Like he still does say like some kind of reasonable things that I think are kind of factually true. Like I think kind of some of his claims,
like what?
some of his I know, for example, like when he kind of like criticizes the marriage between Muhammad and Aisha, I think kind of that's reasonable. When he criticizes the death penalty in Sharia law for apostates, I think that's reasonable. And so, having seen the way that he kind of like was more quick to kind of assume the worst than he would be from someone from another background in that kind of Twitter case, I think like that's something that he kind of needs to work on reforming. And so I wouldn't say that I support him like kind of until I've sort of seen that kind of reform. And similarly, and like people might say, oh, you'd accept reform from Tommy, like you're being unfair. Like what about kind of Muslims reforming? And I'll tell you right now, like I know former supporters of Abdullah Faisal who and I like talk to them, and I'm not like tarring them with the brush forever. I'm giving them the chance to kind of redeem themselves as well. So I'm not being inconsistent about that.
Okay. I just realized the time is 2:00 over here.
What country are you in?
I'm in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, I thought you lived in the UK.
The Mad Cully.
Sometimes I was living in the UK, but I'm non-domicile, meaning I'm staying in Saudi Arabia and I work here.
Let me introduce
I didn't realize the time was too late for you.
Yeah, bring some people in, please.
Some people are.
Big up Joe. Can I ask Hamza, like, what do you think of what I said about Tommy? Like, do you think that's a reasonable position?
Not fully, no. But then again, some of the questions go back to morality, and then that will go back to God. There's some more questions I would like to ask, like why did it take you so long to realize he's biased? Like all he ever does is speak about the Muslim crimes. Now you don't have to be exceptionally smart to see he only ever focuses on Muslim crimes. He goes and supports Tan under this guise of freedom of speech, but he never ever supported anyone else. Oh, sorry, not just Tan, but example, people in the park. You'd never see them supporting freedom of speech for anything or anyone else, apart from when it comes to right-wing rhetoric, which is racist by nature. So the same thing with Tommy. All you ever hear him talk about is the crimes of Muslims, even though it's not representative of Islam, like extramarital relationship. Very well in Islam you have to be married. So
or
this concept, well, we're not in UK when we're talking about grooming gangs, we're not actually talking about slaves. So what Tommy tends to do, is to attribute any problem to Islam, so his followers can make that assumption that Islam is bad, and most of them tend to be very uninformed, a very uninformed audience, which is unfortunate, and this is they take him as the source of information. Anyway, so extramarital meaning outside of marriage. So someone just typed in extramarital and question mark. So yeah, again, it took you that long to understand that Tommy is biased against Muslims. It's peculiar. James.
I mean, we've had to kind of go into the specifics, but we can bring in other people if you want.
Yeah, bring in other people. I'm getting tired of speaking.
Hey Joe, take your mic off mute and say something. You was on the panel for the longest.
Yeah, man.
Introduce yourself.
So my name is Joe. I'm from a Muslim background, and I've just joined basically to provide an alternative narrative. What
do you think about James, the hate preacher?
I don't think he's a hate preacher. Actually, I think he's quite intelligent.
And you seen him in the park spreading hate?
No, not at all. Actually, I think he still.
He's arguing against big man like Adnan, I'm trying to refute the boss Adnan. Are you crazy?
Well, I respect Adnan as an elder, but he's to say he's got monopoly over the truth, and the fact that people who are slandering.
People are gonna say I'm trying to set the Muslims apart on each other.
No, well, the fact is those Muslims who say that are paranoid or insecure.
And we
And
need some firebrand Muslims on the panel, man. Who's gonna tell me I'm a kafir?
No, definitely not. And those who are slandering James, I think, is just a ploy to stop him from speaking, because he does
Silence
seem
his arguments, so they don't have to deal with his arguments.
it's emotional rhetoric. And because James actually researches, for example, he knows about the 4 jurisprudential schools and whatnot, he's much of a tougher challenge to them. And so just label him as an Islamophobe, which is cowardly.
Mad thing.
Yeah.
All right, pause for a minute. I'm gonna make you ask some questions based upon what you've been listening to. But first, I want to introduce Rob. Is it Rob? I think it's Rob.
Hey guys, good evening to you.
What's up, Rob? You're definitely a hate preacher. You've been doing this thing for the longest time. Look at your profile picture as well.
That's the gin and tonic. That's the gin and tonic icon. The show we do every Friday. We're always inviting Muslims to come on the show. We're reading the Quran and we can get a Muslim perspective. And Muslims seem to be very unwilling to come and join us on the show. And I don't know why.
It's obvious why.
Why is it obvious? What is obvious?
Because there's no need for a Muslim to give a platform to someone who makes their agenda to attack Islam. It makes no sense. And ask Turkeys don't vote. Hear me?
Attack?
Well, let me just formulate my sentence and then you can ask your question. Turkeys don't. Well, okay, go on, speak.
What's an attack? What's the difference between attack and critique, or is it just your subjective opinion when somebody talks loudly and firmly? Is that an attack?
Okay, so your question there. Okay, so let's rephrase that to make you happy and say it's a critique. Still, Turkeys don't.
Happy. Just be honest.
Oh, hey, are you gonna actually let me speak or what? Well, you've only been on for maybe 1 minute or so.
No, but just don't go into a long monologue, Hamza. You and I.
No, I haven't. You've only let me speak for 5 seconds and then you interrupted in each time.
Well, I get the
point. So if you want to ask a question, well, you can only get the point if I said it. So if you want me to speak and answer the question, I can do so. If you want to make a point, go ahead.
So are you agreeing that it's subjective between critique and attack? And this is like Islamophobe. It's just a word that's thrown out there when somebody doesn't like the way somebody critiques.
So the original question was as to why Muslims may not join your panel. So the point is that if you have a platform which critiques Islam, for example, because you weren't happy with the word attacks, and attack can be verbal as well as physical. So I don't have a problem with using attack, even if you may. So you can't expect Muslims to vote for, or Turkeys to vote for Christmas. It just doesn't make sense. So I don't think any Muslim minds talking to you, but you can't expect them to support you in something which ultimately leads to your financial betterment.
Okay, so you've made a lot of claims there. Have you ever watched the Gin and Tonic show?
No.
No. Okay, so you're making an ignorant claim, right? Firstly, there's
about
no financial benefit.
So you don't ask for support. I've seen. Yes, you do.
I used to ask for support to get
okay, thank you very much.
So
no, I've seen you. I've seen you on the videos. I've seen you on the small clippets. I've never actually watched the whole show. So you can't say that you don't ask for support. So my statement wasn't incorrect, actually.
Support to come to Speaker's Corner, right?
Yeah.
And anyway,
right.
regardless of whether I'm asking for £1 million
the support, right?
5p, that's irrespective of having a conversation on the show. We're actually
you've asked the question. You've asked a question as to why Muslims don't support you. You don't understand, so I explained to you.
I'm not asking for their support. I'm asking for them to come on the show and
if they participate indirectly, they're supporting.
This was just meant to be an introduction, guys. Let's not.
I know, but you can see I've spoken to James for a long time, and it wasn't vitriolic. It wasn't trying to catch you or this and that.
No, but if you make a lot of mistakes, Hamza, I've got to jump in. Otherwise, you do a long monologue.
So you've tried to make one correction. You tried to make one correction, and you were wrong in that one correction. You did ask for donations. You admitted it, and it's on record.
Yo, for real. I beg both of you. I beg you don't say nothing for a minute, car. We can get into the back and forth thing, but for real, like Joe said, it was only supposed to be an introduction. I was gonna make Joe go first and give his take on what he witnessed if he wanted to ask any questions, because he's been waiting for the longest time still. So we can get into that conversation. It sounded interesting a little bit still. We can get into that after, but I want Joe to go first still.
Yeah, well, the conversation has been long between James and Hamza, so I can't remember everything that was said. But I remember the conversation on morality, which was, where do we get our morals from and whatnot. And Hamza presented the divine command theory view, which is that good and evil only come from God. and it was sort of presented as the Islamic view, whereas there's been multiple theories on morality and good and evil in the Islamic tradition. I was just putting that out there, so just so people don't think that this is quote unquote the gold standard in the Islamic intellectual tradition. And the other point I wanted to address was the claim that regarding the science of hadith. Now, if you're referring to science as what we conceive of today as a qualitative field with numbers and empirical fields, then the hadith method does not fit into that category. I'll just call it a hadith method, so to speak. Now, the claim was being made.
Why is it called science of hadith?
The reason why it's called science of hadith is because in Arabic is known as ilmul hadith. Ilm in Arabic just means knowledge, and it's used for literally any type of field or subject of study. And even in classical English, they use the term science for social sciences as well, which are not so. Even the term social science, for example, just synonymous with the term knowledge. That's all. That's why I just say I wouldn't use the term today because of the connotation we have of science, which has changed over time. Now, James asked the question as well whether the commentaries of hadith, so for example, he mentioned Ibn Hajar, he was a famous commentator on hadith and Bukhari, whether his commentary and his explanation actually has a chain of narration back to the Prophet and the companions, whatnot. And Hamza admitted that he does not know. And I'd just like to plug that knowledge gap in, which is the fact that no, he does not provide a chain. And the explanations of the hadith are just the individual commentators' comments on the hadith. So that I'd just like to answer that James' question. And the other thing that was being said was James mentioned that the difference between the historical method and the hadith science or hadith method is that historians admit that their historical claims only yield probability. So why do Muslims then insist that the hadith method gives them certain knowledge that yes, this is what the Prophet said? As a matter of fact, actually, the scholars of hadith don't actually mention this at all. They actually say that the 99.9% of hadith only give you probability as well. So they're in line with James in this matter too. They say they give you something called van. Van means probability. And there's only a very small category of hadith that gives you certainty, which is known as yaqeen. And to the extent that when hadith experts were asked how many hadith like this are they said, for example, Ibn Salah, who wrote one of the famous primers in hadith, he goes, I can only find one. You have Ibn Jawzi, who said, I can only find 4 hadiths of such example. So again, massive.
Hey Joe.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you. I'm getting the feeling that you're a Quranist.
No, I'm not a Quranist at all. I just I'm not Quranist.
Who are you?
I'm just non-denominational. I'm an academic Muslim.
Say that.
Listen, sorry guys. It's 2:00 here. It's 2:30 actually now. I've enjoyed the discussion.
Man. Don't run away, man.
You can't keep me up all night, bro. It's Thursday. Was it Thursday night tonight?
Yeah. Rob, what you saying? Is that come you try to bonfire and Rob real quick before you ban?
No. I wasn't trying to bonfire, man. It just turned out.
Hamza, I think I don't quite know why there's friction between you and Rob, but
it wasn't meant to be.
I've experienced Rob to be kind of at least as reasonable and stringent in trying to avoid bias and be objective as I am. So I know kind of I deserve probably kind of like as much or more kind of if you're treating Rob that way, then I know it makes sense for you to kind of like treat me that way as well.
No, I'm not treating him.
Hamza's being unfair.
It seemed like I don't know exactly what happens, but maybe there's some like prior context I don't know.
No, nothing.
There's no problem. He and I have had conversations before, but I've been listening to some of it, and he's making claims unsubstantiated about the universe, about other things, and then about the gin and tonic show and so forth. And so I just
what did I actually say about the gin and tonic?
And so I just wanted to jump in and correct that.
Why should you expect Muslims to go on there to support your show or something?
I explained that.
When all they're doing is slagging off Muslims or something like that.
I never said that. I never said that.
I added on that last part still.
I'm saying that Muslims. I'm saying that Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. This is the answer to the question that you were saying.
That's got nothing to do with the show. What I'm asking for is people to come on to defend their faith. We're reading the Quran. We're looking at it from a non-belief point of view. Muslims like yourself and others that supposedly have some knowledge on this, because we've had a couple of guys come on and they've been very poor apologists, right? So we're looking for people that claim to have some knowledge on this thing. And maybe it's my colleague Stop Spamming who scares people away, who has actually read the Quran, has got a bit of knowledge, and no Muslim wants to come on and give his perspective on the Quran, right?
Yeah.
And maybe, like I say, it's my friend that scares people away. I don't know. But at least if that's honest and they don't want to come on because Stop Spammings will reveal, some lack of rigorous thinking, then be honest about that, right?
Is there a question there?
The question is, so you're somebody that's obviously quite an intellectual guy and clearly read the Quran. So why don't you come on and read it with us, verse by verse? That's what we're doing. We're literally reading. We've got 3 translations. We can go to the Arabic if necessary, and we are reading the Quran.
Yeah, well, generally, I've not gone into anyone else's panel, showing his content over anything. I just barely jumped onto this
but
Google
you've been
Hangouts.
before, right? So you're used to it.
I've been on Google Hangouts, I think, twice before, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's the same thing.
I don't know. I have to see if I'm bothered. It does take time, Even this discussion alone, I think it's taken quite some time. So, I have family as well. I've got things to do. So I'm hardly on these.
Wait, this ain't on the front, Hamza. This sounds like the last time I'm gonna air you on COE. If you expect man like Speaker's Corner Rob to just bum rush the place unannounced. I don't know, fam.
No. To be honest, Rob, I've not gone on anyone's show. So, if you're inviting me, I don't know. It sounds like a semi-invite there.
Yes, okay, I'm inviting you. So there's a first time.
So then I suppose we can look forward from that point on once you've invited me and you make clear your questions. But I've not been on anyone else's show apart from Leon's show.
That's fine. So yes, I'm inviting you.
And I'll be honest.
8 p.m. UK time, any Friday.
Okay, sure. My time is restricted, but let's see what we can do. I have to be honest. I remember your description in your channel was slightly different, but I'm not sure if you've changed that in your YouTube channel about where it says description. Yeah. Welcome to the Gin and Tonic Show. Did you change that recently?
Not that I can remember. Why? What is it? Why? What did you remember?
Well, at the moment it's saying we discuss Islam and its impact on the 21st century from a non-believer perspective. So I was just asking, have you changed that?
I don't think so. I mean, that's what we do, and obviously we want guests on. If guests don't come on, then we have to do it on our own, right? But if we have other perspectives, we've had other Muslims on, but they've sort of made stuff up. They're obviously not that well versed in the Quran, unfortunately. And so that's why we're asking for people who are better versed and can put their point across, right?
Because when I look at the thumbnails as well, I know a thumbnail isn't the whole story, but it seems like it's just Islam, things, topics like jizya.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's a show focused on Islam. We don't focus on Christianity, Scientology, anything else.
Like, is Islam a cult and what happens to so you can see, I think you can guess as to why you don't have many guests, no, as in Islamic Muslim guests. So when you have the Mona Lisa covered in a niqab.
So that's well, I don't know where you get the Mona Lisa covered in a niqab, but anyway,
it's a thumbnail.
It's a title about what we're discussing, right? Is Islam a cult? And then we followed through the in that particular example, what are the characteristics of a cult, right? Or whatever the claim may be, or whatever the topic is. Now we are going through the Quran. We're on Surah 2, right?
No, I'm just answering your first question as to why you're saying that you're not sure why you don't get many Muslim visitors. It could be because
Hamza,
the thumbnails,
Hamza, if you're about to go to bed, can I know since you've been sort of leading the interview so far, can I ask you kind of one quick question on what your thoughts are about al-wala wal-bara and whether you understand that, whether you kind of agree with it and whether you understand that part of that to be discouraging close friendships with non-Muslims?
I don't know. I'd have to read about it, to be honest. I can tell you something off the top of the head, but then because it's such a sensitive topic, if I get it wrong, then I get it wrong. And Muslims are very particular in saying stuff from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, because of the hadith of the Prophet who says, "Man kadhaba alayya, whosoever lies upon me, let him assume his short seat in hellfire." So unless I read about the topic,
Yo, Hamza,
Mhm.
just on that quick point on that lie, who lies upon me. I swear, a lie is when you intentionally
Yeah,
say
I'm
something
done.
that's
It
not
says
true.
intentionally.
Hamza, do you think
But if but
when
that's difference between a mistake if you speak mistakenly. If you say something that's not true and you
Mm.
thought it's the truth, that's not a lie, right?
yeah.
Well, this is the thing in Islamic theology. We believe that knowledge precedes speech. That you're not meant to speak on topics unless you know.
when Adnan kind of spoke on topics that he wasn't fully familiar with, he should have said, "I don't know. I don't want to lie on the Prophet."
Yeah, check it out. There's a statement of one of the jurists, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, when the people came to him and they asked him questions, and he kept on saying, "I don't know, I don't know." And the people said, "We come so far. What should we tell the people?" And he said, "Tell them that Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he does not know." So yeah, they say that this "I don't know" is the shield of the believer. It protects the believer. An unfortunate thing is the nature of the park is that people go home, read the hadith, and then they come to Muslims with this expectation that they should know everything. And this is what I mentioned before. This is what I mentioned before. And Muslims often feel obliged to answer a lot of these questions.
Are you a Salafi, would you say?
I would say that I'm non-denominational, but I tend to
Okay.
be Salafi more than anything.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think
But what
sorry,
does Salafi mean?
James, you could have guessed that he lives in Saudi Arabia.
No,
What what does
I know
Salafi
I
to
know
you mean?
Quranists from Saudi Arabia, but they're in jail. I don't know them personally, but whatever.
Anyway, gentlemen, it's been nice talking to you guys, particularly you, James. A long conversation. I'm knackered. It's literally. I had surgery on my back, splinectomy, where they take the bone out of the spine. So my back is shattered. I'm not meant to be sitting up. So it's been a difficult one. So you're gonna have to excuse me, guys. I really have enjoyed the conversation, and perhaps we can have a rejoinder sometime later in the future, inshallah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I enjoyed it too.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, respect,
All
Hamza.
right,
Safe for
yeah.
coming on. Safe for
All right,
coming on, fam.
all right,
cheers,
guys. Take care of yourselves.
Don't know,
Yeah.
brother.
Good night.
Peace.
cheers, Hamza.
Assalamu alaikum.
Hey Joe.
Cheers,
Hey, Joe,
everyone.
you gotta take over from Hamza now still. I've been trying to invite some of the brothers on, but they're just in the chat saying that they ain't gonna be here for much longer. So I don't know.
No, no worries.
Did Ziryab send you the link?
Yeah.
Hey, Ziryab, come on as well, man. I sent the link out to a few people still.
I'm
I don't
probably
want
only
it to
going
seem
to
like it's
be
just a,
up. I'm only going to be here for another half hour, I'd say. But
yeah.
it's all good.
You know what it is?
Yeah.
I don't want it to seem like it's a us versus them thing. Even though I'm just trying to discuss information like as in an objective fashion. You get me? So regardless of what it is, but I know there's a lot of people that's what's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot of dishonest people that will present a narrative
Yeah.
in order to turn people against learning new information.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to try and
So
keep it
yeah.
on surface level.
Yeah. So I'll just respond to James because he asked a question which was not answered. I don't know whether he heard my response, which is that yes, commentators of hadith don't bring a chain narration. They just commentate on it according to their own knowledge or what they've learned. That's one thing. And the second thing is, I present you some different narratives as well regarding Islamic views on morality. You had the Mu'tazila, who were known as the literally the term in dissenters, but they're termed as the rationalists in the Anglosphere and in academic discourse because they believe that there does exist objective good and evil out there, and our mind is capable of deducing morality from the world itself. So that was a different narrative presented to the quote-unquote gold standard Muslim narrative, which is that no objective good and evil is only from God, only from God. Likewise, you had the Maturidi tradition as well. The thing is, what happened with the Mu'tazila was they were politically repressed and their books were burnt, so they don't exist much now. But a group that does exist and a theology that people do subscribe to are the Maturidis, which again they say that our intellect and with common reason and common discourse we're able to come to objective good and evil facts, but a revelation sort of supports our intellect because the creator of the intellect and revelation is the one and the same. So there would not be any per se conflict. So I'm just presenting different narratives out there regarding
Yeah.
the morality position.
I've heard of the Mutazila before, and
Yeah.
Can I ask what are the main differences between Maturidis and Mutazila then? Like, are Maturidis less rational than Mutazila?
Well, the difference would be is that the Mu'tazila are ontologically they believe in objective good and evil. So objective good and evil exists out there, and they're epistemologically objective as well, saying somebody would therefore, using their own intellect, be able to ascertain them truths. The Maturidis, however, would agree with them, saying our intellect is capable of ascertaining good and evil, but ontologically, it's dependent on God as well. That's the difference. So what Mu'tazila do is they subject God to the objective good and evil that exists out there, whereas the Maturidis would say God is the very source of good and evil, but epistemologically we're able to get to that anyway using our intellect. This is why, for example, the Maturidi school is of the belief that communities, for example, in the Amazon rainforest, who the religion, quote unquote, has not come to them, nor no revelation or prophet or message of the oneness of God, whatnot, they're still going to be held to task by God because they're able to reason with their faculties, see nature around them, and come to some sort of belief in the divine, in the transcendent. Anyway, so that would be the difference between the Mu'tazila and the Maturidis, which is the Maturidis is that they believe objective good and evil is tied to God, whereas Mu'tazila would say is independent of God and God is subject to them very standards.
Okay, yeah.
And the view that Hamza was proposing is the Ash'ari view, the Ash'ari school, which believes that no, good and evil does not even exist. Our minds cannot even come to that. We only get it via revelation only. Which is again is a position within the Islamic intellectual tradition, but it's not the only tradition which it was being painted out as.
Yeah, sure. That's good.
And regarding hadiths as well, which you mentioned, I did tell you that, but I did mention again that vast majority of them are probabilistic in nature anyway, and Islamic scholars and experts admitted that. So I don't know why he was insisting that yes, the hadith method is an infallible project. That clearly it isn't. It's built on human contingencies.
Yeah, like I mentioned to him that another thing that we could talk about later would be there are many claims in kind of the Sahih Hadith books of things that are kind of totally impossible and wrong. Like, for example, there's a hadith that's reported by kind of, I think, several different Sahaba that Muhammad said that if you eat 7 Arabian dates in the morning, then you will not receive any harm from poison for the rest of the day. Or and also, and other versions say any harm from poison or magic for the rest of the day. So I mean, like, I mean, come on,
Yo, Joe, people saying your mic sounds low. I don't know if you can do anything to turn it up on your end.
Well, I've got a sore throat. That's the problem. Otherwise, I'll be louder next time I come on. Hopefully.
All right.
But can you still hear me though? That's the main thing, really?
Yeah, they say they can hear still. They're just saying you sound low, man. But I turned you up as far as I can from this end. You get me? But
yeah,
people are still complaining.
I'd say to James as well is that so yeah, them hadiths which are present in the hadith collections, they were actually rejected by many early theorists. It's only this new trend of Islamic thought which is very literalistic or hadith orientated, And the fact of the matter is that, for example, you know, Dhahabi, who's a famous historian, like he rejects many of these hadiths, saying they're impossible and they were fabricated later. Um, yeah, I'll give you just one famous example, which is accepted by many, is that there was an aubergine seller, and this aubergine seller fabricated a hadith on the tongue of the Prophet, saying that whoever eats such and such, well, basically what happened was his business was running low, his trade was running low.
So can you say that a bit louder? I can't hear.
So there was an aubergine seller, right, and his trade was running low, so he fabricated a hadith saying that eating aubergines will give you such and such a reward. So from that day on, his business was booming. So
yeah, that shows how people can have an incentive to make things up sometimes.
yeah, exactly. And regarding them scientific hadiths, which are classed as sahih but clearly contradict science, they were actually rejected by many scholars anyway. Yeah, so recently where the people engage in mental
I have come across for example, in history, what one of the hadith reports is about contagious diseases, and in it, Muhammad said, apparently is reported to have said to a group of Bedouin shepherds, like that one thing does not infect another, and there was I think a sort of a scholar living in Spain who kind of said that we must reject these reports that kind of clearly contradict our kind of something like a common sense or our reason or the evidence. And I think he was actually kind of killed as a heretic.
Yeah,
is that something that you've heard of, or does that kind of match?
Yes, I know who you're referring to.
And I think this wasn't like kind of a later thing. I think it was like, as I recall, kind of maybe around 1100 or 1200.
Yep, and the reason that would have been normative practice early on within the Islamic tradition. The reason why he probably was killed because of the rise of hadithic, more textually orientated Islamic thought, so to speak. Because early on, for example, you have Abu Hanifa, for example, who, as you're well aware, he's one of the founders of the fiqh schools. He actually mentions the same principle, that whatever contradicts reason, and he mentions tajriba, which means experimentation or science, basically, as in something you repeat over and over again. For example, the example they mention is alcohol. It intoxicates because by normative practice, time and time again, we know it does so. Any hadith that contradicts that, then we reject it out of the window.
Yeah, so that's good.
That was in early Islamic thought anyway. And the reason why this kind of literalistic thought occurred was people wanted to codify Islam and formulate an orthodoxy with a capital O, and have, fiqh, how to run society, have rulings for even little minutiae. That's why they began to record down hadiths, whereas previously the term sunnah actually just meant the ethical normative practice of the Prophet, and not the hadith and texts which were written down and formulated a while later.
I see. Do you accept the possibility that some of these hadith where Muhammad says something that's inaccurate are true, in that they do report something Muhammad said, and that like you aren't are you kind of discounting the possibility that Muhammad might have kind of given out some sort of misguided advice or witch doctor style advice? Are you just kind of automatically assuming no, that would never happen because he's the prophet of God?
No, I do believe that is an entirely possibility, but also the fact of the matter is that, for example, yeah, it's definitely entirely a possibility, and I accept that to be the case. But the problem therein lies is when we're reading these texts in the hadith collections, then we have to also realize that at least 99.9% of these hadiths, again, not only do they give you probability, but they're narrated by ma'na, which means by meaning. So the actual reports are not verbatim what the Prophet said. They're actually, like, for example, if I was to talk to somebody now that this is what James said, I wouldn't be able to relay exactly what you have said, like verbatim, word by word. And even the hadith experts actually acknowledge this. They said they were narrated by meaning and not by word.
Okay, cool.
And there's also a view that obviously the Prophet was only a prophet in terms of religious transmission and not through scientific means and others. So he could have very well made mistakes in that regard, and it doesn't take away from the core message.
Yeah, well, there's also like a couple of examples of him making scientific claims and infusing a kind of religious sort of religious authority to it. So, for example, in the kind of claim about in the hadiths about him saying that there's no such thing as contagious diseases, he says, and he explains, you know, God has written, because God has written in each thing, it's in each organism, God has written its, you know, its destiny, and so he's kind of attaching his, you know, he's kind of giving religious backing for his claim. So it's not exactly the same as when he said like, oh, why didn't you try breeding this fig tree with that fig tree? And so there are some examples of him kind of being reported to have kind of said something that's scientifically wrong, but also kind of sort of doing it with his authority of as the kind of prophet of God.
That hadith, just initially, I'm skeptical of it because during this debate regarding predestination and whatnot, that was a massive source of polemical controversy in the early period of Islam after the Prophet's death. And the Prophet generally in the hadith and even the Quranic message doesn't talk about, it doesn't use the term qadar and predestination and free will debate.
Well, he says something like God has written or something like that. He doesn't. I'm not sure if he uses the word like what is it, qadar? But
yeah. But okay, I'll have to check the hadith out properly. But just on initial hearing,
I'll paste it in the back chat. Or I can bring it up on screen.
Yeah, because we'll find many of these hadiths where the Prophet will be speaking about something which was not appropriate or correlate with the audience and the socio-political milieu that he actually existed in, as if they were back projected onto him to give claims religious authority. So you'll find, for example, this debate that I mentioned, you'll find hadith the Prophet talking about free will and predestination, whereas we don't find that in the primary sources of Islam, and it seems that it was back projected due to polemical purposes.
Okay, I mean, so I've gone on to sunnah.com, and I hear what you're saying, but it's a little bit hard to believe that I know like people would generally know that things do infect another. Like if you have an infectious disease and you're in proximity, you're more likely to reach that disease. Like that would be kind of common knowledge, and so it's a little bit harder to think about a situation whereby kind of a scholar would be in a position to benefit by kind of spreading kind of information that goes kind of contrary to something that's kind of would have otherwise been widely known. And so like this is the hadith that I've got up on the screen now. It's Jami at-Tirmidhi, but other narrations of it you can find if you search like a mange camel, then you get a version of it narrated by Ibn Umar, and various kind of related ones. But I guess we can like look into it in more. We don't need to kind of go into the minutiae. There might be more interesting things to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I profess ignorance right now. Well, it's interesting to look into it. I'll try looking at the commentaries as well and see what people have said.
Generally, kind of in the English translation, the kind of the English translations have in brackets kind of sort of without God's permission. So they say like, oh, one thing doesn't infect another, and then they add without God's permission, like to sort of like try and solve it in a way. Like have you come across in kind of have you come across in hadith commentaries where the scholars are like, they realize that something's wrong here, but they kind of want to accept that this report wasn't made up and that Muhammad did say it, and so they kind of inject some sort of kind of made up commentary to kind of try and like fix it.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, mental acrobat. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that's
But usually these kind of things where they try their best to interpret the hadith is from the later periods of Islam. Really, the early generations were much more lax because, for example, they never put much more emphasis on written down codifications of hadith law anyway. As I mentioned, Sunnah was a more priority, which is just the ethical norm and practice of the people. So, for example, not even Sahih hadiths are acted upon. Some Sahih hadiths are consciously, knowingly, quote unquote, rejected. So, for example, Malik, for example, who wrote the Muwatta, which was earlier than Bukhari's Sahih, he includes many Sahih hadiths in there, and thereafter he comments saying, "Nah, don't practice them," because he gave more precedence to the normative practice of the people of Medina during the time, rather than the hadith collated thereafter. So he found the ethical practice of the people in Arabia of more closer to the Sunnah, so to speak, than the hadiths that were recorded down later. Because, words on a paper only tell you so much, rather than a living tradition, so to speak.
Okie dokie. Like, do you mind while you're here and I have your perspective, what do you believe that offensive jihad is something that Muhammad did, or do you believe that's kind of based on the historical evidence and textual evidence? Did you believe that Muhammad only sort of ordered his men to attack people who had attacked the Muslims? I'm of the opinion that Muhammad did order attacks against groups of non-Muslims who had never attacked or committed offences against the Muslims.
Well, I think such sort of portrayal of the Prophet are in imperial interests. So the expansionist mind frame certain Muslims have, which was present in some early dynasties, for example, they clearly had an incentive to portray the Prophet as such. Whereas from the Quran, I don't really get such. And from the Hadith, there are a few narrations as such, but I'm not too clued.
Wouldn't it be? Wouldn't you have to kind of create? Well, so for example, there's a book of so like the Sirah, like the biographies of Muhammad, originally started out as like a record of his battles, like Sirah.
Maghazi,
yeah. So it would be quite a big forgery to kind of like, for example, Ibn Sa'd to be like, I'm going to make up a book of multiple reports of Muhammad sending out kind of unprovoked attacks in the last couple of years of his life. Like, don't you think kind of it's a little bit too conspiratorial that it's something that was made up by later caliphs?
Well, I'd say that do you know the Sir and Maghazi literature, regarding the battles and the prophetic biography? Those are well known and well established, even between Orientalist scholars as well, and even in academia. That these are historically reliable as compared to the Hadith tradition, which is even still, I'm not saying it's perfect or infallible. Because, for example, Ibn Sa'd does not include chains of narrations, and if he does, they're very spurious as well. And for example, and Ibn Hisham has also been severely criticized by the early jurists. For example, Imam Malik, for example, called him a Dajjal, an imposter. And he goes, even if he was the last person on earth and he was hanging on the drape of the Kaaba, the holy cube in Mecca, he would not even take a single narration from him. So it's quite telling how these have become institutionalized within the Islamic literature for certain gains and purposes. But yeah, generally the Sierra Maghazi tradition is a weak source of history.
Okay, so are you totally agnostic toward you? Is your position that you don't really know anything that happened in the last 2 years of Muhammad's life?
Yes, I say I don't know much. We don't know much about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm generally agnostic. Yes.
Can I jump?
And you don't think that kind of chapter 9 has some parts that have an apparent meaning of kind of offensive attacking? Joe? Yeah,
James.
I didn't catch that, sorry.
I asked like, do you think that chapter 9 has parts of it with an apparent meaning that call for offensive attacking or like offensive war making?
In the apparent sense, then yes, I do see where somebody could take such an interpretation or reading from.
Okay.
I'll let Ziryab jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say, on a more fundamental level, the sources you mentioned, like in the Sirah literature, so whether it's Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq, are fundamentally secondary sources as opposed to the Quran. So let me pose this one real quick before I continue on this line of thinking. Do you accept the Quran as being primary source in the sense of it being from the same century as the Prophet, peace be upon him?
Yeah, like the earliest Quran is dated to that time. So
right. So and then you also acknowledge and accept that whether it's Ibn Sa'd Tabaqat or Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq, so whether it's the Maqazi or the Sirah literature, these are from the 8th and 9th centuries, and they are born out of say no more. They're born, so they're secondary. So what I'm saying is, to build any argument from secondary sources on the Prophet's life is going to be problematic on that fundamental basis.
Yeah, but we've talked about this a little bit before, but I know it.
So that's just the first outlining point, but secondarily, in regards to the substance, so the argument of Surah 9, this surah or chapter is specifically, as you know, relating to it's called, so is it this chapter entitled Forgiveness? Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah, it has Tauba, like, yeah, that's chapter 9, I think.
If memory serves me correctly, and keeping what I just said in mind, and now as you as a student, me putting myself in your like POV, utilizing the history and the primary and the secondary sources, you would know as well as I do that this chapter is mainly relating to the Hawazin and the Thaqif. So if you look at the normative Islamic corpus of literature, you'll find with the reference of jizya and in the reference of fighting, it even mentions the battle's name in the surah, Hunayn. It gives you a context of what seemingly problematic or on the face of it aggressive verses actually mean. So there is no indication of wanton aggression in the Quran. In fact, we have the opposite. As I said, numerous verses which talk about fight those who fight against you, but do not transgress, because Allah does not love the transgressors in other verses, right? So we have numerous verses and saying, even going to the extent of saying forgiveness is better, and so on and so forth. So that's that. I mean, again, that's another point. But to open up the conversation maybe and ask, why is it then that medieval jurists have utilized one or two verses? No, it's not you, James. It's jurists who have done it first, taken certain verses and then said that these verses now abrogate all of these verses regarding peace and so on and so forth. I guess that would be the logical continuation of that kind of thinking.
If you have like two sets of instructions, like one set that seems to be kind of like calling for peaceful behavior, and another set of instructions that's calling for kind of aggressive behavior, then obviously they're in tension with each other. And so seems like one of the kind of more logical steps is that you'd think, well, if he said something before, and if he said one thing earlier and another thing later, then probably the later command is the more updated version, and it's the kind of commands that we ought to be kind of continuing forward.
And while I see the merit of that argument, my response would be, that the numerous verses which indicate the Jews and the Christians, sometimes even the Zoroastrians, the Sabians, and so on and so forth. And then it also mentions those who believe in Allah on the last day. And if we translate Allah as God, for argument's sake, in this situation now, and make a further step from that Quranic basis of looking at the verses in question, as in the verses in Surah 9 which talk about jizya, essentially, actually goes against what I just outlined there, because it talks about those who don't believe in Allah and the last day. So if, as we said, it's those who don't believe in God in the last day, it can't be Jews and Christians and people of the book and so on and so forth, even to the extent it can't even be Zoroastrian. And again, and that's without even diving into the context, which is about, again, Hawazin and Taqif. And that's not me saying it. When you look at the corpus of tradition, you'll see that being outlined as well. So it's a question of dissecting, and that's what it should be called towards, and there's not a problem with that. People don't have to get all alarmist about contentions.
Well, so have you said that fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, and you said that can't refer to like Christians and Jews because they believe in Allah and they believe in the end of the world. But what it says is fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who are given the scripture until they give jizya willingly while they are humbled. And so the part of kind of and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful, kind of the Jews and the Christians didn't accept his messenger, and so kind of on that basis, like, doesn't this apply to them?
I think.
What's considered unlawful here, I would argue, is aggressive warfare, as the verses relate to the Hawazin and the Thaqif, the two tribes who were aggressive towards the Muslims for no reason otherwise. So the point I would argue is that what is forbidden here is aggressive warfare, and given that they are allowing that, then it's specifically regarding them. It's not regarding other ones or other people. But Joe,
and this verse was in retaliation to the tribes that killed the Prophet's messenger. The Prophet sent a messenger to them tribes, and they slaughtered him. And it was in this context that this was revealed in. So it's not advocate. Well, the reason of revelation was not advocated for aggressive warfare anyway.
When you combine it with some of the other verses in chapters 8 and 9, like for example, Quran 9:1-3 also says, "O you who have believed, fight to those adjacent to you of the disbelievers, and let them find in you harshness, and know that Allah is with the righteous." And also in chapter 8, there's that verse that is either 8:38 or maybe 8:28, which says kind of something like, "Fight until all religion is for Allah," or like, "until there's no more fitna and all religion is for Allah." So there are a few kind of verses that seem to apparently call for aggressive warfare. And when the scholars kind of and when these jurists, these kind of scholars of Islamic law kind of try to look at the reports of that try to give these verses context, like the reports in Hadith and so on, reports such as those that kind of say that I've been commanded to present three options: either kind of convert to Islam, or pay the jizya, or be fought. Like there are several kind of these reports that have been recorded, like it seems that kind of I'd have to say that most of the evidence seems to support the jurist conclusion that the Quran is calling in for kind of war to spread the religion of Islam, and whereas like, you know, a kind of alternative reading seems to be a little bit less well supported, or significantly less well supported by kind of the evidence and what the apparent meaning seems to say.
Would you be interested in doing another show on this topic, on that particular topic?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So inshallah, we'll hook that up and sort that out. And
yeah,
because
yeah,
but I think because it's just late and whatnot. But
yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'm probably gonna go to bed soon after this.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll just say that initially I would call your attention to your line of argument earlier, which is that later verses, or you could see them, or you kind of outline how later verses could supersede the verses which come up before. And so you implicitly kind of accepted that there are numerous early verses which talk about peace and not to transgress, or not to aggress, because Allah doesn't love the aggressors, and how Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and so on and so forth, almost forming like a parliament of religion where they are going to be given their due, all those who do good, and so as until the end of the verse. And then later on, you're saying that, or initially you were saying that these verses of aggression or fight those, right? But if we can establish that regarding Hawazin and Thaqif, so these two Bedouin tribes who were aggressive against the polity, then it wouldn't be fit we take that verse and apply it generally. So whether you then kind of go on to secondary sources to buff up that argument, the initial argument is problematic. So that's why that future conversation will be interesting. But I'll just open it up if anyone else wants to jump in.
I think I've kind of run out of steam a little bit. I'm but thanks for kind of having me on, Leon. I'm gonna kind of hop out and kind of catch you guys all later. Ziryab, we will do a show. I've got you on Google Hangouts, and so it's not going to be like a hit and run. We should try and talk through this properly and see which interpretation is better supported. So yeah. Okay.
Respect, James. Islam here, number one. Say none. Peace.
Yeah, and I just want to underline that I make criticisms about the doctrine, and I'm not in favor of bigotry against Muslims.
Yeah, man, it's cool. It's cool. Keep it up. I'd say keep it up.
I would just want to say that I was impressed with your conversation with Adnan, James. You kept a cool head. You didn't have any sort of coherent response, and everything he said was wrong, which you calmly showed. So, just keep up the good work there, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Okay, see you guys later.
Take care, man.
Peace. You saying so we got Steve, Joe, and Ziryab. We usually want to talk about. Anything?
Yeah, I like the fact that Joe was also critical of Adnan, because what I notice is many Muslims just blindly follow whatever people say in Speaker's Corner. So it's good to hear other Muslims that don't agree, right? If an atheist says something I don't agree with, I will point that out, right? So it's good to hear that from other Muslims, because it's rare in my experience, right? That protect each other even if something's wrong. So it's good to hear.
I think you need to get this Speaker's Corner bubble, you see. where you interact with just a certain mold of a Muslim.
You saying you don't think in Speaker's Corner there's a good representation of the variety of Muslims?
Definitely not 100%. I think it's evident. I think as somebody yourself who's been going there for a while now, you'd be able to pick on the, the script, quote unquote, the attitudes and the general way of outlook of life which everybody has. It's a monoculture there.
Well, I don't really know nothing about Islam or Muslims much outside of the park anyway, so
I feel sorry for you, man.
so why you don't go? Where you live too far?
Well, the fact is that when there used to be a slight variety, when other people used to come down there to the park, we could see what used to happen to them, right? They got bullied out the park, which they don't come anymore now.
You give example. Give example. People gonna think you're getting shit.
I don't want to plug in names in it, but I think it's quite evident where different Muslims of different beliefs and different, attitudes and being who came, and the way they were treated by their quote unquote very own. It's quite telling why you've got a monopoly there of a certain brand of Islam. It's evident. It's probably been one of your top vids, Leon. It's people being chased out the park and everything. That's just
people like Saracen. You mean? You don't have to. I can mention
Muslims.
I don't want to plug names. There've been many who come and who stop coming now.
Oh, and the Shias as well, right? Yeah, that's why the park obviously doesn't have that, and everybody sees the Muslims as all one group, right? And we always stress there's a difference between critiquing Islam and individual Muslims, right?
But the funny thing is that there's certain people as well who want to just propagate that perception, i.e., this is a Muslim, which again is quite ironic.
Well, that's why we need to constantly separate
Hey, was he speaking? I can't hear nothing.
Islam from the challenge I see is that Leon, you can't hear.
Yeah, it might just be me though, car. Even before we started, that happened to me still. Yeah, so continue if you're speaking.
Yeah, I think that the challenge is, and I've spoken to like Sufi Muslims, right? The challenge is they take the whole Quran subjectively. So when you have the literalist fundamentalist who reads the Quran and he has a very plausible, straightforward reading of the Quran, like beat your wife or whatever else there is, that's very straightforward. So if you're not going to follow that, or if you want to come up with some other interpretation for that, you need to do a lot more, intellectual work to try and sidestep that sort of thing. So, I often speak. Discord is where a lot of people are now. A lot of Muslims are on Discord, and there'll be those that straightforwardly, they follow the straightforward interpretation. Then you have a Sufi, or I don't know, perhaps somebody like yourself will say, "Hey, well, I don't really agree with that," and you go, "Well, what's the reason?" "Oh, I take it subjectively." And unfortunately, I mean, I said to the Sufi, "I'll happily live next door to you, right? You're a quote unquote like a good Muslim, but good Muslim, according to me, is the people who don't follow the Quran literally and straightforwardly, right? So if you've got another view on the Quran, but then to other Muslims, you're going to be a bad Muslim. So I mean, what's your take on this, Joe? Or
I think it's interesting that you insist that reading the Quran literally and straightforwardly is the normative way to read it, and that people who don't read it as such are somehow doing this whole thing wrong.
Send down a message that was clear, concise, complete, and error-free, and for all people for all time, or is that not a claim that you believe in?
I don't know where you've got that claim from, but you probably heard it in the park somewhere, so you're repeating it here. But
yeah, but I mean,
I got a bounce as well, though. It's been a good conversation with it. It's been good listening in as well.
Mad thing, Ziryab cut out real quick as well. Say nothing.
Hi, man. Cheers, man.
All right, let's call it tonight. Thanks, Leon.
All right, Joe. All right, Rob. Respect both of you for coming on.
Take it easy, matey.
Cool, brother. Yeah, man's gonna wrap it up then still. Man's the last man standing out here still. Ain't about to do a monologue or nothing. Respect for everybody in the comment section, talking, giving their opinions. You get me? Next time I want to do a show on free speech and censorship. I want to do a show on the dualities of freedom and security. You get me? I want to talk about that still, especially with this Article 13 thing. If you don't know about Article 13 and Article 11, how it's going to affect the internet, especially in the European Union, or specifically in European Union, any country that's in there. The EU passed a law the other day, like literally about 2 days ago, where this Article 13 thing comes into play. Basically, all material that gets uploaded to any popular site, internet site like YouTube, Facebook, anything like that has to get checked. Has to get checked to make sure it don't contain any copyrighted material. So if it does, then there's going to be major fines for any platform that's hosting anybody putting up copyrighted material. Now, so experts, I do the quotation mark sign, experts are speculating that the cost to check all of the information that's being uploaded will be so much, will be so hard to implement, and the possible fines will be so much that a lot of the major platforms will just decide not to provide the service in that particular region in it, rather than providing the service and having to pay a bag of fines. They're just might as well not just have no YouTube in the UK. So that's where we at right now still. That article got passed still. So yeah, I don't know. It might get sticky on the internet over here still. So I feel like that's the next show that man want to do on still. So anybody who knows what I'm going for the like even VPNs, because there's like countries like China, they ban VPNs still. So everybody's thinking, right, I'm just gonna run a VPN. From that gets banned out here, then man's effed in it. Man ain't got no access to YouTube or nothing over here. That's crazy. You get me, sir? Man want to do a show on that still. Cause that'll just be us shut down. We'll have to start like linking in real life again, like how man used to do before the internet, in order to discuss ideas and opinions. You get me? All of the news and information that we'll be getting will be through the mainstream sources, like back in the day. You get me? That's all dead, man. Everyone's going on YouTube right now to get the information because nobody don't trust the news, the mainstream media. Nobody don't want to be entertained off the mainstream media. That's how come you're here right now. You get me? So, true talk. That's the next show I want to do still. So if anybody got strong opinions on that or know information about that, those type of topics there, send me an email, contentovereverything@gmail.com, and I'll give you links for the next show. You get me? Man, I'll do that ASAP still. But yeah, it's crazy right now. So even on this Brexit thing, you get me? Like, obviously, like ain't really got no. I don't know the terms and conditions on this Brexit thing still, but one thing I do know is that if man was separate from that, then obviously we wouldn't be included in that. You know, we would have been like America or any other country. That vote wouldn't have affected. You get me? Maybe we would have had to make our own. Maybe all the big companies would have, like all the copyright holders and all of those companies there. Maybe they would have tried to push some laws specifically for our country because we ain't in the EU. So maybe it would have still affected us. You get me? But I don't know, fam. That's a mad thing still. A mad thing still. Go look it up, man. Article 11 and 13, man. Yeah. But for now, I'm a fall back, you get me? I'm gonna lock off this show still. Respect for everybody for coming through, man. Yeah, we out. Make sure you send me an email if you want to jump on the next show. Peace.